The last light of day had already disappeared behind the ridge, stripping the landscape of color and sound. The Montana winter of 1887 had seized the land in its merciless grip, turning the world into a vast expanse of white and gray. A blizzard was building, the wind already howling across the ravines like a wounded animal. Through the whiteout conditions, Eliza Reed stumbled forward, each step a battle against the mounting snow. Her breath came in ragged gasps, forming clouds that were immediately torn away by the wind. Blood had frozen in thin rivulets down her face, and wrists dark against her copper skin. Behind her, faint but unmistakable, came the baying of hounds, and men's voices carried on the wind. "Track her down," a distant voice commanded. "That Apache witch can't have gone far in this storm." Eliza's legs trembled with exhaustion, but fear drove her onward. Her torn dress clung to her body, stiffened by ice and blood. The thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders offered little protection against the cold that bit into her bones. 5 days of running, hiding, and running again had left her at the edge of collapse. She felt her knees plunging into the deep snow. For a moment, she considered staying down, letting the cold take her. Death by freezing would be gentler than what awaited her if those men caught up. Then, through the swirling white, she saw it, a faint yellow glow in the distance. A window, a cabin. Shelter. With renewed determination, Eliza forced herself to her feet, ignoring the pain shooting through her frost-bitten limbs. She pushed forward toward the light, each step more difficult than the last. The voices behind her grew fainter as the storm intensified, swallowing all sound except the howl of the wind. When she finally reached the wooden porch, her body was moving on instinct alone. She raised a hand to the door, her fingers nearly too numb to form a fist. The knock she managed was barely audible even to her own ears. No response. With the last of her strength, she knocked again, this time her knuckles making a sound like bone against wood. Then darkness took her as she collapsed against the doorframe. Mason Sullivan sat alone at his rough-hewn table, arms resting on the scarred wood, letting the silence of his cabin settle around him. At 45, his face was weathered by sun and wind, his dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. His blue eyes, once bright with purpose, now held the distant look of a man who had seen too much and lost even more. Out here, silence wasn't peace. It was just the only thing that stayed. The small cabin bore the marks of a life pared down to essentials. A cast-iron stove in the corner radiated heat from fresh split logs. A single oil lamp remained unlit on the shelf. Mason preferred the room dim when the sun fell, the shadows hiding the parts he didn't care to look at anymore. The empty second chair, the shelf with a spot worn clean where a child's wooden toys once sat. The drawer containing a wedding band he hadn't opened in 3 winters. The sound came so soft at first, he thought it was the stove creaking. A scrape, then the faintest knock like bone against wood. Mason didn't move immediately. Cabins this far out didn't get visitors unless something was wrong. Injury, storm, or trouble. Wearing a human face. Another knock, barely there, but real. He stood slowly, joints stiff from the day's work, and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. He didn't raise it, just held it across his arm as he crossed the room and opened the door just enough to see the shape on the other side. The wind shoved a breath of ice in with it. A woman lay slumped against his doorframe, small against the night, her body half covered in snow already. Her shawl was frozen to her shoulders, hair matted across her face, moccasins soaked through and dark with blood or water, he couldn't tell. The dress she wore was torn at the neckline and split along one thigh, the fabric stiff with ice. Even in the dim light, he could see she was Apache. The high cheekbones, the dark hair, the copper skin now blue-tinged with cold. Mason lowered his rifle and pulled the door open wider. He knelt and touched her neck, finding a pulse, weak but present. Without hesitation, he gathered her in his arms and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He laid her near the stove, the closest source of heat, and quickly added more wood to build up the fire. The woman didn't stir as he wrapped her in the thickest blanket he had, an old army-issue wool meant for the harshest winters. Her face was marked with small cuts, and dried blood had formed a trail from her temple down her cheek. More concerning were the raw red marks circling her wrists, the unmistakable evidence of restraints too tight for too long. As the heat from the stove grew stronger, color slowly returned to her face. Mason fetched water from his bucket, warming it slightly before dampening a clean rag to wipe away the blood from her temple. As he did, her eyes flew open wide with terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall, eyes darting around the cabin like a cornered animal. "Easy," Mason said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe here." The woman's breathing was rapid, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts. She glanced at the door, clearly calculating her chances of escape. "Storm's getting worse," Mason said, not moving from his position. "You wouldn't make it 100 yards." Her dark eyes fixed on him, assessing, untrusting. When she spoke, her voice was rough from cold and exhaustion. "Please," she said, barely above a whisper. "Don't leave me out there." Mason didn't answer right away. He watched her, noting how she held herself, trembling with cold, but refusing to cower. When she spoke again, her voice scraped rougher. "I'll give you a bed," she said. "Warm every night, just not out there, not tonight." Mason's jaw tightened. He knew what she was offering, what she thought she had to offer to survive. He stood and walked to the small cupboard near the stove, aware of her eyes tracking his every move. He returned with a tin mug of water and held it out to her, maintaining enough distance that she would have to reach for it. "Drink," he said simply. "Then rest. No payment needed." Suspicion flickered across her face, but thirst won out. She took the mug with shaking hands and drank deeply. When she finished, Mason took the mug back and refilled it from the warming pot on the stove. "You got a name?" he asked finally. She hesitated only a breath. "Eliza." He nodded once, neither welcoming it nor rejecting it. "Mason Sullivan," he offered, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. Names seemed unnecessary in a place where solitude was the only constant. He pointed toward the small wash basin near the door. "Water's warm if you need it. There's food when you're ready." Eliza watched him with the same careful assessment, but her posture had relaxed slightly, the immediate fear of danger receding. She moved to the basin with cautious steps, her gait unsteady. The split seam of her dress opened again at her thigh when she moved, revealing raw skin rubbed from cold and hard travel. She didn't try to cover it, perhaps too exhausted to care about modesty. Mason busied himself breaking cornbread into a pan and adding water to soften it. He kept his back turned as she washed, giving her what privacy he could in the small cabin. "I didn't steal anything," she said suddenly, her voice steadier now. "Not from your cabin, not from any wagon. They said I did so they could take me." Her tone wasn't pleading, just stating a fact she didn't want left to assumption. "I didn't ask," Mason replied, still not looking at her. "I know," she said. When the cornbread was warm, Mason placed the pan on the floor near her. She didn't lunge for it or devour it like someone starved past manners. Instead, she ate with small, careful bites, as if each mouthful had to be tested first. Mason watched the way she held the bread in both hands, careful not to drop a crumb. Fingers bruised across the knuckles. Something about her manner told him she'd been hungry for a long time, longer than just her journey through the snow. While she ate, Mason went to the trunk in the corner, the one he rarely opened these days. He lifted the lid and pulled out a folded wool undershirt and an old pair of flannel trousers, the legs too short for him now, but would be long enough for her. He set them on the table without comment. "These will be warmer than what you're wearing." Eliza stared at them a moment, like she didn't trust they were being offered. "You want me to work for them?" "No." She stood and stepped closer, cautious. "You won't touch me for them?" "No," he said again, more certain this time. Some of the strain in her shoulders eased, but not the weariness. She reached for the clothes like an animal edging toward water, then looked around the room and back at him, a question in her eyes. Mason nodded toward the small alcove behind a makeshift curtain. Not much of a place, but it was out of sight. She nodded once and disappeared behind it. He heard the fabric move the soft drag of cloth over cold skin, a small hiss of breath when she pulled the dress from her body. Mason kept his eyes on the stove, but his thoughts wandered to uncomfortable places. Who had hurt her? How long she'd been running, what would happen if whoever was after her tracked her to his cabin. When she emerged, the shirt hung past her hips, and the trousers were tied at the waist with a strip torn from her old dress. The bruises on her wrists showed clearer now, and a half-healed gash along her collarbone was visible at the edge of the too large shirt collar. She had managed to comb her long black hair with her fingers, though it still fell wild around her shoulders. She stood near the table waiting for direction, the way someone does when being allowed inside still feels temporary. Mason nodded toward the stove. "Rest," he said. Outside, the blizzard had fully arrived, the wind screaming around the eaves of the cabin, rattling the shutters Mason had secured earlier. Inside, the small space had changed in some indefinable way. It was no longer a place meant for one man's solitude. Whether that eased something in Mason or tightened it, he couldn't tell yet, but Eliza hadn't asked to leave, and he hadn't told her to go. That was enough for the night. In the deep hours before dawn, when the fire had burned down to embers, Mason sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, watching the woman sleep. Eliza had curled herself near the stove, wrapped tightly in the wool blanket, her face finally peaceful in sleep. Her breathing had steadied, though occasionally a small tremor would pass through her body, as if she were running, even in her dreams. Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a silver medallion roughly the size of a $50. Its surface was etched with symbols of an Apache tribe, the metal tarnished with age and wear. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it, both physical and symbolic. 5 years. 5 years since the campaign against the Apache in the Northern Territories. 5 years since he had been part of a unit sent to pacify a village that military intelligence claimed was harboring warriors responsible for attacks on settlers. 5 years since he had witnessed what pacification really meant. He had taken the medallion from the ground that day after the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped. He couldn't say why he kept it, perhaps as a reminder of the moment he realized what kind of man he didn't want to be. Shortly after he had left the army, citing his wife's illness as the reason. Catherine had indeed been ill then, though not seriously. The real sickness had been in his soul. Now, looking at the woman sleeping on his floor, Mason wondered if fate had a cruel sense of humor. Had he saved an Apache woman to atone for those he couldn't save before? Or was this some cosmic punishment, forcing him to confront his past sins? He slipped the medallion back into his pocket as Eliza stirred her eyes, opening suddenly alert, even in the moment of waking. She sat up, the blanket clutched around her shoulders, eyes finding him immediately in the dim light. "You didn't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. "Someone should keep watch," he replied. The first gray light of dawn was seeping through the frosted window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a muffled, snow-laden silence. Mason stood his joints, protesting after hours in the chair, and added wood to the stove. The cabin was cold, his breath visible in the air. "Those marks on your wrists," he said, not looking at her. "Whoever did that to you, are they looking—" Eliza's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. "Maybe, if they're sober enough to remember I ran. Tell me." She sat straighter, the blanket still wrapped around her for warmth. "I was taken from a trading post near St. David. They claimed I stole goods from a wagon. I didn't." She paused, her gaze steady. "A man named Reed owned the trading post. He sold me to settle a debt." "Reed was your husband?" Mason asked, noting her use of the name. A bitter smile touched her lips. "Reed owned the trading post where I cleaned. He gave me his name so customers would think I was his servant, not—" She let the sentence trail off, but Mason understood. "Who bought you? Men taking furs north. They kept me tied at night, used me during the day." Her voice was flat, emotionless, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "When we reached Helena, they lost at cards. The winner took me as payment." Mason's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "And then, 3 men, trappers. They were bringing me to a place where men pay for women." Eliza's gaze never wavered, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the blanket. "They drank heavily 2 nights ago. The one who held the rope got careless. I hit him with a rock and ran." "You killed him?" Mason asked, no judgment in his voice. "No," she answered. "But I hurt him badly. They'll want revenge as much as they want me back." Mason nodded, processing this information. "How many men?" 3, maybe more, if they hired trackers." He crossed to the window, rubbing a clear spot in the frost to peer out. The landscape was transformed, buried under feet of new snow. No tracks, no smoke from any camp, no riders sweeping the horizon. If someone had followed her trail before the storm, they'd have lost it now. "Snow's deep," he said. "No one's moving fast for a while." Eliza didn't relax at this news. "When it melts, they'll come." Mason turned back to her. "By then, you'll be gone if that's what you want." Something unreadable passed across her face. "Where would I go?" It was a fair question, one Mason had no answer for. Instead of responding, he moved to the small shelf where he kept his meager food supplies. "You hungry?" She nodded, and he set about preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with the last of his dried berries. As he worked, he was aware of Eliza watching him, studying his movements with the careful attention of someone accustomed to assessing threats. "You were Army," she said suddenly. Mason paused a spoon halfway to the pot. "What makes you say that? Your coat hanging by the door. The way you move. The blanket you gave me has military markings." He nodded slowly. "Scout. Served 7 years. Fighting Apache." The directness of her question caught him off guard. He considered lying, then decided against it. "Yes, among others." Eliza absorbed this information without visible reaction. "You live alone a long time." It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. 3 years? Since they died?" Again, not a question. Mason turned to look at her fully. "What makes you think someone died?" "The empty spaces," she said, simply gesturing around the cabin. "You look at them when you think I'm not watching." Mason felt exposed, as if she had read his private journal rather than just observed his cabin. He returned to stirring the pot, uncomfortable with her perception. "My wife and daughter," he said finally, voice low but even. "Fever took them 3 winters back, buried them up where the ground doesn't flood when the thaw comes. Eliza didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. She only nodded once, as if that piece of truth answered an unspoken question about why he lived alone this far out. When the food was ready, Mason filled 2 bowls and handed one to Eliza. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin and the occasional pop from the stove. Outside, the world remained eerily quiet, as if the snow had muffled all life from the Montana wilderness. As Eliza finished eating, she reached into a small hidden pocket in the remains of her dress, which lay folded beside her, and withdrew a small object wrapped in a scrap of leather. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a piece of yellowed paper folded many times until it was no larger than a playing card. Mason watched with interest as she examined the paper, her expression revealing nothing. She seemed to be checking that it was intact rather than reading it. "What's that?" he asked. Eliza hesitated, then re-wrapped the paper and tucked it back into its hiding place. "Nothing important, just a map the man who owned me was carrying." "A map to where—" Her eyes met his, guarded once more. "I don't know. I took it because I thought it might be valuable enough to trade for food or shelter." Mason could tell she wasn't being entirely truthful, but he didn't press the issue. Everyone had their secrets, especially those who had survived what she had. "You should rest more," he said instead. "You're safe enough for now." Eliza looked toward the window where daylight was growing stronger. "And when I'm stronger, I'll leave. When the snow melts." Mason nodded, though something in him resisted the idea. Not because he wanted her to stay, he'd grown accustomed to solitude, but because he wasn't sure where she could go that would be safe. "We'll figure that out when the time comes," he said. The stillness that followed the blizzard lasted 3 days. The world outside the cabin transformed into a vast expanse of white. Mason spent the mornings digging paths to the lean-to where his horse and 2 milk cows were sheltered, breaking ice from the water trough and bringing in wood for the stove. Each day, Eliza grew visibly stronger, the color returning to her face, her movements more sure. She insisted on helping with tasks inside the cabin, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, mending a tear in one of Mason's shirts she found in a basket. She worked quietly, efficiently, careful not to disturb his routine more than necessary. At night, she slept on a pallet near the stove wrapped in the army blanket, while Mason took his bed in the far corner. Neither spoke much, but a rhythm developed between them, an understanding that required few words. Mason found himself growing accustomed to her presence, the small sounds of another human moving through the confined space no longer jarring after years of silence. On the 4th day, as Mason prepared to go hunting, Eliza approached him as he cleaned his rifle at the table. "I need to check something," she said, gesturing toward the door. "Outside." Mason glanced up, noting the determined set of her jaw. "Storms passed, but the snow's still deep." "I know. I'll stay close to the cabin." He studied her face, trying to discern her intentions. Expecting someone, a flicker of something fear-anger passed across her features. "No, just need to see the land, to know where I am." Mason nodded slowly. "Take my spare coat. Boots by the door might fit if you stuff the toes with rags." She gathered the items, wrapping herself in the oversized coat before stepping out onto the porch. Mason watched through the window as she made her way carefully through the path he'd dug, then paused, surveying the landscape. The snow stretched unbroken in all directions, the trees at the edge of the clearing standing like black sentinels against the white. Eliza turned slowly, taking in the full panorama, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Then she did something curious. She walked to a large pine at the edge of the cleared area and ran her hand along its trunk, as if searching for something. Finding a spot she seemed to prefer, she pulled a small knife from within her clothing. Mason hadn't realized she had it, and carefully carved something into the bark. From his vantage point, he couldn't make out what it was, just that she worked with purpose, glancing over her shoulder occasionally as if to ensure she wasn't observed. When she finished, she tucked the knife away and made her way back to the cabin, her face composed once more. Mason stepped away from the window before she could catch him watching. "See what you needed?" he asked when she came inside, shaking snow from the boots. "Yes," she said simply, offering no explanation for her carving. Later that day, while Eliza napped near the stove, exhausted from her first venture outside, Mason slipped out to examine the tree. The mark she had carved was small, no larger than his palm, and might have been mistaken for natural scarring by an untrained eye. But Mason recognized it immediately as an Apache symbol, a simplified bird in flight with a small arrow beneath it pointing east. A message. But for whom Mason returned to the cabin, troubled by this discovery, but unsure of its meaning. Was Eliza signaling to someone, warning them, or was it something more innocent? A prayer, perhaps, or a marker to find her way back if she left? He said nothing when she woke, but watched her more carefully now, noting the way her eyes always scanned the horizon when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she kept the small wrapped paper close to her at all times. That night, as they sat by the stove after a simple dinner, Mason decided to test her. "That map you're carrying," he said casually, "where did you get it?" Eliza's hand moved instinctively toward the hidden pocket in her dress, now hanging dry by the fire. "I told you, I took it from the man who kept me. And you don't know what it shows." Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. "Just land, mountains, maybe a river." "Must be important if you risked taking it." A small shrug, too casual to be genuine. "Perhaps, or perhaps I just wanted something of his. Something to balance what he took from me." Mason nodded, letting the subject drop. But later, as he lay in his bed listening to her steady breathing across the cabin, he found himself wondering what secrets Eliza Reed carried, and whether they would bring trouble to his door when the snow finally melted. The days settled into a pattern. Mason would rise before dawn, tend to the animals, and prepare for whatever work needed doing, repairing tools, curing hides, preserving what little meat remained from his last hunt. Eliza would wake soon after moving through the cabin with quiet efficiency, helping where she could without being asked. They spoke little, but the silence between them had evolved from wary to companionable. In the evenings, as the light failed and the cold deepened, they would sit by the stove sometimes with Mason reading aloud from one of the few books he owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, a Bible, and a practical guide to frontier medicine. A week after her arrival, Eliza approached Mason as he worked on mending a broken shutter. "Your shirt, the one I'm wearing," she said. "It's too big. My dress is dry now. I should give this back." Mason glanced up from his work. "Keep it. Winter's long." "I have nothing to pay you with." He set down his tools, giving her his full attention. "I'm not asking for payment." Eliza's expression remained cautious. "All men want something." "Not all," Mason said more sharply than he intended. He softened his tone. "Not me. Not for this." She studied his face as if searching for deception, then nodded once. "Then I will help more. To earn my keep." "Fair enough." That afternoon, Mason showed her how to properly clean and oil his spare pistol, a Colt revolver he kept for emergencies. To his surprise, she handled the weapon with familiarity, breaking it down and reassembling it with practiced ease. "You've used guns before," he observed. "My uncle taught me," she said, checking the cylinder's action. "Before I was taken, we hunted together. Your people, do any of them still live?" A shadow passed across her face. I don't know. Our band was scattered after the soldiers came. Some were killed. Others fled. I was separated from my family during the fighting. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. When was this? 5 summers ago? Eliza said, her voice carefully controlled. Near the Yellow Valley, where the 3 rivers meet. Mason's blood ran cold. Yellow Valley. He knew it well too well. It had been his unit sent there on reports that the band was harboring warriors responsible for attacks on settlers. What they found instead was a peaceful camp, mostly women, children, and elders. The commanding officer had ordered them to proceed anyway. I'm sorry, he managed to say, his throat tight. Eliza looked at him sharply, perhaps hearing something in his voice. For what? You weren't there. Mason couldn't meet her eyes. For what happened to your people? It wasn't right. She finished reassembling the pistol in silence, her movements precise and controlled. When she spoke again, her voice was distant. Few things are right in this world, Mason Sullivan. We survive anyway. That night, Mason's sleep was troubled by dreams he hadn't had in years. Smoke filling the air, screams echoing through a burning village, and a silver medallion lying forgotten in the dirt, its surface catching the sun as he bent to pick it up. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, despite the cold. Across the cabin, Eliza slept soundly, her face peaceful in the dim light from the banked stove. Mason rose quietly and went to the window, rubbing a clear spot in the frost to look out at the star-filled sky. The snow was beginning to settle, compressing under its own weight. Soon, the paths would be passable again. Soon, whatever danger followed, Eliza might find its way to his door. And Mason would have to decide where his loyalties lay, with the woman who had sought refuge in his cabin, or with the past he could never fully escape. The day Mason's supplies ran critically low arrived with a sky the color of polished steel, the air cold enough to burn the lungs, but without the threat of immediate snow. Their provisions had stretched longer than expected. Eliza ate sparingly and knew how to make meals from almost nothing, but they couldn't delay a trip to town any longer. I'll ride in today, Mason announced over a breakfast of the last cornmeal and coffee so weak it was barely colored water. We need flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, whatever else I can afford. Eliza nodded, her expression carefully neutral. How long will you be gone? Full day, if the trails are as I expect. Might be dark before I return. She absorbed this information silently, but Mason could see the calculation in her eyes, weighing the risks of being alone, of him not returning, of someone else arriving in his absence. If anyone comes while I'm gone, he said, loading the revolver and placing it on the table between them, you use this. Don't hesitate. Don't ask questions. Eliza picked up the weapon, checking it with practiced hands. I won't. Mason walked to the small shelf above the door and took down his rifle. You know how to use this, too? Yes, she said without hesitation. I've shot deer. And men. He believed her, which answered another unspoken question, how she had survived as long as she had. He handed her the rifle and the small box of cartridges. There's a place behind the cabin, he explained, where the rock face curves. Forms a shallow cave. If riders come, that's where you go. It's hidden, unless you know to look for it. Eliza nodded, memorizing this information. And if you don't come back by nightfall, Mason held her gaze. I'll come back. It wasn't a promise so much as a statement of intent, but something in Eliza's posture eased slightly. She followed him outside as he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that pawed impatiently at the snow. Before mounting, Mason hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Map to town, he said, handing it to her. If something happens and I don't return, follow this route east. Ask for Sheriff Daniels. Tell him Mason Sullivan sent you. Eliza took the map, tucking it carefully into her pocket. The sheriff will help an Apache woman. Daniels is fair, Mason said, and he owes me a favor. She didn't ask what kind of favor, just nodded and stepped back as Mason swung into the saddle. He looked down at her, standing small but straight on the porch, the rifle held confidently across her arm, his oversized coat wrapped around her against the cold. "Bar the door," he said. "Don't open it unless you hear my voice." "I won't run," she said, answering a question he hadn't asked aloud. "If they come for me, they'll find the door empty. Not your blood." Mason studied her face a beat longer than necessary, then nodded once and turned his horse toward the trail that would eventually lead to the small settlement of Elk Crossing, 2 hours' hard ride to the east. Elk Crossing consisted of little more than a dozen buildings strung along a single rutted street. A general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and a handful of cabins housing the few families stubborn enough to carve out a living in this unforgiving country. Mason rode directly to Jennings's general store, tying his horse to the hitching post out front. Inside, the air was warm and carried the mingled scents of coffee, tobacco, leather, and coal oil. Harold Jennings, a thin man with a perpetual stoop and suspicious eyes, looked up from behind the counter as Mason entered. "Sullivan," he said by way of greeting. "Thought you'd hold up till spring thaw." "Almost did," Mason replied, setting a small pouch of coins on the counter. "Need supplies. Flour beans, coffee, salt, ammunition for the Remington." Jennings raised an eyebrow at the list. "Planning for company? That's more than your usual." Mason kept his face impassive. "Winter's been hard. Takes more to get by." Jennings held his gaze a moment too long, then shrugged and began gathering the requested items. As he worked, the door opened again, admitting a blast of cold air and 2 men Mason didn't recognize. The taller of the pair was a striking figure, late 40s, with a neatly trimmed black beard shot through with gray and cold blue eyes, set in a face weathered by years in the elements. He wore a heavy buffalo coat over trail-worn clothes, and a Bowie knife hung prominently from his belt. His companion was younger, stockier, with a pock-marked face and small, darting eyes. The bearded man nodded to Jennings, then let his gaze settle on Mason, with the unhurried assessment of someone accustomed to sizing up potential threats. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying the faint traces of an educated Eastern accent. "New faces are rare this time of year." "Mason Sullivan," Jennings offered from behind the counter, "has a place up near Black Ridge. Keeps to himself mostly." Mason nodded slightly in acknowledgement, but said nothing, disliking being discussed as if he weren't present. "Thaddeus Blackwood," the bearded man introduced himself, extending a gloved hand. "This is Jenkins." Mason shook Blackwood's hand briefly, noting the strength in his grip. "Just passing through business," Blackwood replied with a thin smile. "Always business. You been in these parts long, Mr. Sullivan?" 3 years, Mason said, turning back to Jennings. "How much for the lot?" As Jennings calculated the total, Blackwood moved closer, examining the supplies being assembled on the counter. "Quite a haul for one man," he observed. "Must be planning for a long winter." Mason felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. "Just stocking up." "Wise," Blackwood said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "Never know what might happen out in these wilds. I heard there was a blizzard through here recently." "Week ago," Mason confirmed, paying Jennings and gathering his purchases into a sack. "Nasty business, blizzards," Blackwood continued, "though sometimes they work in a man's favor. Cover tracks, hide evidence." Mason paused, looking directly at Blackwood now. What kind of business did you say you were in?" The smile that spread across Blackwood's face didn't reach his eyes. "I track things that people have lost, Mr. Sullivan. Sometimes property, sometimes persons." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper which he spread on the counter. It was a crude drawing of a woman's face, high cheekbones, straight nose, determined eyes. Even in the rough sketch, Mason recognized Eliza. "Perhaps you've seen this woman?" Blackwood asked. "Apache. Answers to Eliza, or Reed's girl. Ran off from her rightful owner about a week ago, just before the storm hit. Dangerous, I'm told. Killed a man during her escape." Mason kept his expression neutral with effort. "Can't say I have." "No," Blackwood pressed, watching Mason's face carefully. "That's disappointing. There's a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery." "I live alone," Mason said, hoisting his sack of supplies. "Don't see many people, especially in winter." Blackwood folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "Well, if you do happen to come across her, you'd be wise to keep your distance. She's not just a runaway, she's a thief. Took something of considerable value that doesn't belong to her." "I'll keep that in mind," Mason said, moving toward the door. "One more thing, Mr. Sullivan," Blackwood called after him. "If you do see her or anyone suspicious, you can find me here in town. I'll make it worth your while." Mason nodded once without turning and stepped out into the cold, his mind racing. So Eliza was being hunted, and not just by the men she had escaped from. This Blackwood was a professional, a bounty hunter by the look of him, and there was something more at stake than just returning a runaway. Something of value, Blackwood had said. The map Eliza carried. He secured his supplies to the saddle and mounted quickly, eager to be away from town and the unsettling presence of Thaddeus Blackwood. As he turned his horse toward home, he caught sight of Jenkins, the pockmarked man, watching him from the saloon porch across the street. The ride back to the cabin seemed longer than the journey, in the horse struggling through snow that had begun to develop a treacherous crust on top. Mason pushed as hard as he dared, anxiety growing with each passing hour. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, though each time he stopped to listen, there was only the profound silence of the winter forest. To be safe, he took a less direct route back, detouring through a narrow ravine that would be difficult to navigate for anyone not familiar with the terrain. By the time he emerged onto the ridge above his cabin, the sun was already sinking toward the western mountains, casting long blue shadows across the snow. From his vantage point, the cabin looked undisturbed, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney into the still air. No tracks marred the snow around it, except those Mason himself had made that morning. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by confusion at the intensity of that relief. When had Eliza's safety become so important to him? He urged his tired horse down the slope toward home, the cold air burning in his lungs as he called out, "Eliza, it's Mason!" The door opened immediately, and there she stood, rifle ready but lowered when she confirmed his identity. Something in her posture, the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her chin, told him she had been waiting perhaps for hours with the same anxiety he had felt on the return journey. "You came back," she said simply. "I said I would." As he dismounted and began unloading the supplies, Eliza moved to help, taking packages from his arms. Their hands brushed briefly in the exchange, and Mason was struck by how warm her skin felt against his cold fingers. She didn't pull away immediately, and for a moment something passed between them, an acknowledgment, perhaps, of the tenuous bond that had formed in the week since she had appeared at his door. Inside, as Mason stoked the fire and Eliza put away the supplies, he debated how much to tell her about his encounter in town. She deserved to know she was being hunted, but he hesitated to add to her burden of fear. "Something happened in town," she said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Mason looked up, surprised at her perception. "What makes you say that?" "Your eyes," she replied. "They're watching shadows that aren't here." He sighed, deciding honesty was the only path forward. "There's a man in town looking for you. Thaddeus Blackwood. Bounty hunter, I'd guess. Had a drawing of your face." Eliza's hands stilled where she was measuring coffee into a tin, but her voice remained steady. "Did he say why he's looking?" "Said you killed a man during your escape. That you stole something valuable." She turned to face him fully now. "And what did you tell him?" "That I hadn't seen you," Mason said. "That I live alone and don't see many people." Eliza studied his face, perhaps searching for deception or regret. Finding neither, she nodded once and returned to her task. "He'll come here eventually." "Probably," Mason agreed. "But he doesn't know for certain you're here, and the snow works in our favor for now." "What happens when it melts?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Mason had no ready answer. Taking in a fleeing woman for a night during a blizzard was one thing. Harboring her against professional bounty hunters, possibly becoming complicit in theft, or worse, was another matter entirely. Yet the thought of turning Eliza over to Blackwood, or even of sending her away to fend for herself, sat like a stone in his gut. "We'll figure that out when the time comes," he said, finally echoing his words from days earlier. Eliza accepted this non-answer with the pragmatism of someone accustomed to living one day at a time. "Did you learn what he thinks I stole?" "No, just that it was valuable." Mason hesitated, then added, "Is it the map?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on some middle distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Yes, but it's not what he thinks." "What is it then?" Eliza reached into the hidden pocket of her dress and withdrew the leather-wrapped paper. She unfolded it carefully on the table between them. The map was crudely drawn, but detailed, showing a section of mountain terrain with a river winding through it. X marks and small symbols dotted the landscape, with notes in a spidery hand along the margins. Mason couldn't read the language, but he recognized it as Apache. "This shows the location of a place sacred to my people." Eliza explained, her finger tracing a circle around one of the X marks. "A hidden valley where the sick go to heal in hot springs that rise from the earth. But the men who captured me believe it shows the location of gold." "Does it?" Mason asked. A small, bitter smile touched Eliza's lips. "In a way. The rocks near the springs shine yellow in certain light. My people use them for ceremonies. They have no value except to us. But these men think it's a gold mine." "Yes. They killed the Apache man who carried this map, thinking he was hiding riches. When they couldn't understand the markings, they kept me alive to translate." She looked up, meeting Mason's gaze. "I pretended not to understand it. Said it belonged to my husband who was dead. They believed me, but they wouldn't let me go." Mason studied the map again, seeing it with new eyes. "And this Blackwood, he's working for the men who captured you." "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "Maybe. Or maybe he heard rumors of Apache gold and is hunting on his own. Why keep the map? Why not destroy it?" Something shifted in Eliza's expression, a softening, a vulnerability she had not shown before. "Because it shows the way to the last place I know my people might be." After the soldiers came, those who survived fled to the sacred valley. I had been separated from them, taken to work at the trading post. This map is my only chance of finding what family I have left. The weight of her words settled over Mason like a physical burden. The valley she sought might well hold survivors from the massacre his unit had perpetrated 5 years ago. Her people, the very ones he had helped to destroy. The silver medallion in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, a tangible reminder of his guilt. "When the snow melts," he heard himself saying, "I'll help you find this place." Surprise flickered across Eliza's face, followed quickly by suspicion. "Why would you do that?" Mason couldn't give her the real answer, not yet. Instead, he said, "Because Blackwood won't stop looking, and you'll have a better chance with help than alone." She studied him for a long moment, then carefully refolded the map and returned it to its hiding place. "Perhaps," was all she said, but Mason could see the faint hope that had kindled in her eyes. That night, as Eliza slept near the stove and Mason lay awake in his bed, he found himself wondering what he would do when they reached the sacred valley, if they reached it at all. Would he confess his role in the destruction of her people? Or would he carry that secret with him forever, another burden added to those he already bore? And if she learned the truth, would she use the skills he now knew she possessed to put a bullet through his heart? Perhaps, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, that would be no more than he deserved. The day after Mason's return from town brought a change in the weather. The sun shone with surprising strength for February, turning the snow's surface into a glistening crust by midday. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, the first tentative herald of a thaw that was still weeks away. Mason spent the morning checking his trap lines, returning with 2 rabbits that Eliza efficiently skinned and prepared for stewing. They worked in companionable silence, the routine of shared tasks now familiar after nearly 2 weeks together. It was only as they sat down to eat that Eliza broached the subject neither had mentioned since the previous evening. "This man Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You think he will come looking?" Mason considered his response, weighing honesty against the desire to spare her worry. "Yes," he said finally. "Men like that don't give up easily, especially with money involved." "How much time do we have?" The "we" didn't escape Mason's notice, a small but significant shift in how she viewed their situation. "Hard to say. Snow's starting to crust, but it's still deep. Trails won't be clear for at least another week, maybe 2. He paused, watching her face. "If you're thinking of leaving before then, I'd advise against it. Cold can still kill even with the sun out." Eliza nodded, accepting his assessment. "Then we prepare for when he comes." "That's wise," Mason agreed. "But there's something you should know first." He hesitated, unsure how to proceed. "The man you killed during your escape. Blackwood had a wanted poster with your face on it." Eliza's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened slightly around her spoon. "I didn't kill anyone. I hit a man with a rock when he tried to force himself on me. He was alive when I ran." Blackwood seemed to think otherwise. "Blackwood is being paid to think whatever benefits his employers," Eliza said, a hard edge entering her voice. "If they claim I killed someone, it makes my capture more valuable and my treatment afterward more severe." Mason nodded slowly. It made sense. Bounty hunters weren't known for their commitment to truth, and a murder charge would certainly justify a higher reward. "Regardless, it complicates matters," he said. "If Blackwood involves the law claiming you're wanted for murder, no sheriff will believe an Apache woman over a white bounty hunter," Eliza finished for him. "I know this." They fell silent, the implications hanging between them. Mason had suggested going to Sheriff Daniels if she needed help, but if there were wanted posters circulating, even Daniels might feel obligated to detain her. "We should make the cabin more defensible," Mason said after a while, changing the subject to more practical matters. "Board up the back window, maybe dig a shallow trench along the north approach, where the snow is thinnest." Eliza's gaze sharpened with interest. You've defended positions before. In the army, yes. Against Apache. It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. Sometimes, more often against Comanche further south. Something flickered in her eyes, not quite suspicion, but a renewed awareness that he had once been on the opposite side of a brutal conflict. You were good at killing my people. The directness of her question caught him off guard. I was good at tracking, he said carefully. Good at reading sign predicting movement. The killing. He trailed off, unwilling to lie, but unable to fully articulate the complex truth. The killing came with the job. Eliza supplied her voice surprisingly free of judgment. Mason nodded, grateful for her understanding, even as guilt twisted in his chest. If she knew his specific role in the Yellow Valley massacre, would she still sit across from him planning their mutual defense? After we eat, she said, returning to practical matters, show me where the best approaches are, where someone might try to come in unseen. Mason agreed, relieved by the change in subject. As they finished their meal, he found himself studying Eliza with new eyes. There was a sharpness to her mind, a strategic thinking that went beyond mere survival instinct. In another life, in another world where her skin color and gender didn't limit her opportunities, she might have been a military tactician herself. Outside, the sun had reached its zenith, the glare off the snow almost painful to the eyes. Mason led Eliza around the perimeter of the cabin, pointing out natural lines of sight and potential blind spots. Ridge to the north gives the best view of the cabin, he explained, pointing to a rocky outcrop about 200 yards away. Anyone with a decent rifle could cause trouble from there. Eliza shaded her eyes, studying the terrain. Trees to the east would provide cover for an approach, she observed. And that depression near the stream could hide several men. Mason nodded, impressed by her assessment. You have a good eye. I learned young, she said simply. When soldiers hunt your people, you learn where they might hide. The casual statement hit Mason like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. We should check the trees, he suggested. Make sure no one's been there. They trudged through the snow toward the eastern edge of the clearing, where a stand of pines offered concealment. Mason noticed that Eliza moved differently outside, more alert, her eyes constantly scanning, head turning slightly to catch sounds. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to survive by detecting danger early. As they reached the trees, Mason examined the snow beneath them. The melting from above had created slight depressions around each trunk, but there were no footprints or other signs of human presence. No one's been here recently, he confirmed. Eliza knelt, running her fingers along the bark of one of the pines. This tree, she said, the one I marked before. The symbol is a message. Mason kept his expression carefully neutral. A message for whom? My people, she said, looking up at him. If any still live and travel this way, it tells them I am alive and heading east when the snow melts. You think they might find it? Eliza stood brushing snow from her hands. Probably not, but it gives me hope to leave it. Mason nodded, understanding the need for such small gestures in a world that had taken so much from her. We should head back, he said. Start on those defenses. They worked through the afternoon, Mason boarding up the smaller rear window, while Eliza helped by handing him nails and holding boards in place. When that was done, they gathered loose rocks from around the property and stacked them strategically near the front porch, simple cover that could make a difference in a firefight. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, they stood back to assess their work. The cabin looked more fortified now, though it would never withstand a determined assault by multiple attackers. Still, it was better than it had been. It's a start, Mason said. Eliza nodded, her gaze distant. When I was a child, my father taught me that the best defense is to not be found at all. Wise man, your father. He was, she agreed, a hint of sadness coloring her voice. The soldiers killed him first when they came. He stood in the open hands raised, trying to speak with them. They shot him where he stood. Mason's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Eliza turned to look at him directly. You say that often. I'm sorry, as if these tragedies touch you personally. He couldn't meet her eyes. They do, he said finally. All suffering should touch us personally. She seemed about to say more, when a sound interrupted them, the distant but unmistakable crack of a rifle shot echoing across the valley. Both froze heads, turning toward the sound. Hunters, Eliza suggested, though her tense posture suggested she didn't believe it. Mason shook his head. No one hunts these hills in February. Game's too thin, snow's too deep. Another shot rang out closer this time. Inside. Mason ordered, his voice dropping to a whisper. Now. They hurried back to the cabin, Mason scanning the surrounding forest for movement as they went. Once inside, he barred the door and retrieved his rifle from beside the fireplace. Could be nothing, he said, though he didn't believe it. Someone shooting at a wolf, maybe. Eliza said nothing, but moved to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the shutters. Her body was tense, coiled like a spring. They waited in taut silence as the minutes stretched. No more shots came. Outside, the shadows lengthened as the sun continued its descent. Might have been farther away than it sounded, Mason suggested after a while. Sound carries strangely in the cold. Eliza remained at the window, vigilant. Or closer, and they've stopped shooting because they're moving in. Mason couldn't argue with her logic. He checked his rifle again, making sure it was loaded and ready. If someone comes, let me talk first. Might be nothing to do with you. She shot him a skeptical glance. 2 rifle shots days after you were seen in town and questioned about me. I don't believe in such coincidences. Neither do I, Mason admitted. But there's no sense in shooting first if we don't have to. Eliza moved away from the window, finally retrieving the pistol Mason had given her from its place by her bedroll. She checked it with practiced hands, her movements efficient and calm, despite the tension in the air. If it's Blackwood, she said, not looking up from the weapon, he won't take me alive. The quiet determination in her voice sent a chill through Mason. It won't come to that, he assured her, though he had no right to make such promises. She met his gaze, then, her arc eyes unreadable. You don't know what they did to me before. What they would do if they caught me again. She touched the half-healed gash along her collarbone, a visible reminder of her previous captivity. I won't go back to that. Mason wanted to tell her he would protect her, that he wouldn't let anyone take her, but the words stuck in his throat. He was one man against what might be several, and he had his own ghosts to contend with. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging her decision without judgment. As darkness fell, they maintained their vigil, taking turns watching from the window while the other rested. No more shots disturbed the night, and no riders appeared on the moonlit snow. By midnight, Mason began to think they had overreacted. Get some sleep, he told Eliza. I'll keep watch a while longer. She hesitated, clearly reluctant to lower her guard. Wake me in a few hours. You need rest, too. Mason agreed, though he had no intention of sleeping that night. After Eliza had settled on her pallet near the stove, he took up position in the chair near the window, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the silvery landscape outside. The moon cast everything in sharp relief, the snow glowing with an inner light that turned night into an eerie approximation of day. In such conditions, it would be difficult for anyone to approach unseen, a fact that offered Mason some comfort as the hours crept by. It was nearing dawn, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten, when Mason spotted movement at the edge of the tree line. He tensed eyes, straining to identify the shape that had briefly disturbed the stillness. There, a flash of something dark against the snow, then gone again. Mason raised his rifle, peering through the scope for a better look. For several long moments, nothing moved. Then, just as he was about to dismiss it as a trick of light and fatigue, he saw it clearly, a figure in a heavy coat, crouching low, moving from tree to tree along the eastern approach. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed. He couldn't be certain it was a threat, and he had promised not to shoot first. "Eliza," he called softly, not taking his eyes from the scope. "Someone's coming." She was awake instantly, moving to his side with the silence of a shadow. "Where?" "East side, coming through the trees. Just one that I can see." Eliza took up position at the second window, pistol ready. "Could be a scout. Others might be waiting." Mason nodded. It was standard procedure: send one man ahead to assess the situation before committing the full force, which meant this was almost certainly Blackwood or his men, not some random hunter. The figure had stopped moving, perhaps realizing they had been spotted. Mason kept the rifle trained on the last position where he had seen movement waiting. Dawn was breaking in earnest, now, the gray light revealing details that had been hidden in the moonlight. The figure in the trees had disappeared completely, either retreated or gone to ground. "What do we do?" Eliza whispered. Mason considered their options. They could wait, hoping whoever it was would reveal themselves or leave. They could call out, demanding identification, or they could make a preemptive move using the advantage of the cabin's cover. Before he could decide, the choice was made for him. A voice called out from the trees, deep and carrying an unmistakable Eastern accent. "Mason Sullivan, I know you're in there. I'd like to talk business. Blackwood." Mason exchanged a glance with Eliza, whose face had gone hard and still at the sound of the bounty hunter's voice. "What business?" Mason called back, keeping his rifle ready. "The kind that could make you a wealthy man," Blackwood responded. "All I want is what belongs to my employer, the Apache woman and the map she stole. Give them to me, and there's $500 in it for you." $500. It was a small fortune in these parts, enough to buy proper livestock, better equipment, maybe even a larger parcel of land. For a moment, Mason felt the temptation of it, not seriously, but as a fleeting acknowledgement of what such money could mean. The thought must have shown on his face, because Eliza's expression changed, a flash of fear quickly masked by resignation. "I understand," she said quietly, her hand tightening on the pistol. $500 is more than most men would refuse. Mason shook his head, angry that she would think even for a moment that he would consider Blackwood's offer. "I'm not selling you," he said firmly. "Not for any price." Relief flickered across her features, though she kept her guard up. "Then what will you do?" Mason turned back to the window. "Blackwood," he called out, "the woman's not here. Move on." A pause. Then Blackwood's voice again, closer now. "We both know that's not true, Sullivan. I've been watching your cabin. 2 people go in, 2 people come out. She's with you." Mason cursed under his breath. How long had Blackwood been observing them, and more importantly, was he alone? "She's not property to be bought and sold," Mason shouted back. "Leave my land, Blackwood, or I start shooting." Laughter drifted from the trees. "Your concern for an Apache murderess is touching, Sullivan, but misplaced. She's wanted for killing a man and stealing valuable property. Hand her over, and you won't be harboring a criminal." Mason glanced at Eliza, who shook her head slightly. "I told you," she said softly. "I didn't kill anyone." He believed her. Something about Blackwood's too smooth confidence rang false. "I'm not asking again, Blackwood," Mason called. "Get off my property." For several long moments, there was silence. Then Blackwood's voice came again, colder now. "You're making a mistake, Sullivan. A costly one. That woman isn't worth dying for." "Neither is your blood money," Mason retorted. "Now go while you still can." More silence. Mason kept his rifle trained on the tree line, waiting for movement, for some indication of Blackwood's next move. When it came, it was from an unexpected direction. A single gunshot rang out from the north, and the window beside Eliza shattered, sending shards of glass flying into the cabin. She ducked instinctively, dropping below the windowsill. "Second shooter," Mason warned, already moving to a more protected position. "North Ridge." Another shot cracked through the air, this one splintering the doorframe. They were being fired upon from at least two directions, now Blackwood from the east and someone else from the north. Eliza crawled to Mason's side, keeping low. "He brought others," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. "Just as I feared." Mason nodded grimly. "At least two. Maybe more we haven't seen yet." He checked his ammunition, a full magazine in the rifle plus 20 more rounds in his pocket. Enough for a fight, but not a prolonged siege. "What's the plan?" Eliza asked, surprisingly calm given the circumstances. Mason thought quickly. "They're trying to pin us down, force us into a corner. We need to change the equation." He glanced toward the rear of the cabin. "There's a crawl space under the floorboards in the back room. Tight fit, but it leads outside, comes out near the woodpile." Eliza caught on immediately. "A way out they don't know about." "Exactly. You take it, circle around behind them if you can. I'll keep them distracted from here." She shook her head firmly. "I won't leave you to face them alone." "It's not leaving, it's flanking," Mason insisted. "Besides, you're who they want. If you're gone, they might just back off." "Or kill you for helping me escape," Eliza countered. "No, we stay together." Before Mason could argue further, another volley of shots peppered the cabin, one bullet passing so close to his head that he felt the displacement of air. He returned fire, aiming for the muzzle flash he'd spotted on the north ridge. "We don't have time to debate," he said, feeding more rounds into his rifle. "Either we both go, or we both stay and fight." Eliza's expression hardened with determination. "Then we fight." Mason nodded, accepting her decision. "North and east are covered. That leaves south and west. If we can make it to the rocks behind the cabin, we'd have better cover, maybe a chance to circle behind them." "How do we get there?" "They'll see us the moment we step outside." "Smoke," Mason said, an idea forming. "We create a distraction." He moved quickly to the stove opening, the damper wide, and throwing in an armful of green pine needles he kept for kindling. Thick white smoke immediately began billowing out, filling the cabin. "When it's dense enough, we'll open the back door," he explained, gathering essential supplies, ammunition, water, the map Eliza carried. "The smoke will pour out, giving us cover to reach the rocks." Eliza nodded, understanding the plan. She collected her few possessions, including the pistol and a small knife she kept hidden in her boot. As the smoke thickened, making breathing difficult, they crouched by the rear door, ready. "On my mark," Mason said, hand on the latch. 3, 2, 1, now." He flung the door open, and a cloud of smoke rushed out into the cold air. Using the momentary visual cover, they dashed across the 20 yards of open ground to the cluster of boulders behind the cabin. Shots rang out, but the shooters were firing blindly into the smoke, unable to get a clear fix on their targets. Safely behind the rocks, Mason took stock of their situation. They had made it out of the cabin, but they were still very much in danger. The north ridge gave the enemy the high ground, and the eastern approach offered too much cover for him to be certain how many men Blackwood had brought. "We need to reach the ravine," he whispered to Eliza, pointing to a deep cut in the landscape about 100 yards to the southwest. "It leads to the cave I told you about." She nodded, eyes darting between the cabin and the surrounding terrain. "They'll see us if we try to run for it." "Not if they're busy dealing with a new threat," Mason said, a grim smile touching his lips. He raised his rifle and took careful aim at the fuel barrel stored against the side of the cabin. One well-placed shot, and the explosion was more substantial than he had anticipated, the force of it shaking the ground beneath them. Flames erupted from the side of the cabin, quickly engulfing the dry timber. The distraction worked. Shouts of alarm came from both the north ridge and the eastern trees, followed by the sounds of men moving rapidly. "Now!" Mason urged, and they broke cover, running low and fast toward the ravine. They were halfway there when a shot rang out closer than before. Mason turned to see Blackwood himself standing at the edge of the trees, rifle raised for another shot. Mason fired back, forcing the bounty hunter to duck for cover. "Keep going!" he shouted to Eliza, who had stopped to return fire with her pistol. "I'm right behind you." She hesitated only briefly, then turned and continued toward the ravine. Mason backed away, firing periodically to keep Blackwood pinned down. He was nearly to the edge of the ravine when a burning pain seared across his left arm. A bullet had grazed him, tearing through his coat sleeve and into the flesh beneath. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Mason scrambled down the steep side of the ravine to where Eliza waited, crouched behind a fallen tree. "You're hit," she said immediately, eyes fixing on the blood staining his sleeve. "Just a graze," Mason assured her, though the wound burned like fire. "We need to keep moving. They'll be on our trail soon." Eliza ripped a strip of cloth from the bottom of her shirt and quickly bound his arm. "Which way to the cave?" Mason gestured downstream where the ravine deepened and narrowed. "Half-mile. There's a bend where the walls rise higher. Cave entrance is hidden behind a stand of junipers." They moved as quickly as the rough terrain allowed, staying low to avoid being spotted from above. Behind them, the cabin continued to burn, sending a column of black smoke into the winter sky. Mason felt a pang of regret at the loss of his home. Modest though it had been his sanctuary for 3 years. Now it was gone, another casualty of violence he hadn't sought, but couldn't avoid. The cave, when they reached it, was little more than a deep crevice in the rock face, concealed by a tangle of juniper and scrub pine. Inside it widened slightly, offering enough space for 2 people to sit comfortably, but not stand upright. Mason had discovered it during his first year in the territory and had stocked it with basic emergency supplies: a tin box containing matches, jerky, a small blanket, and a canteen of water that had long since frozen solid. "It's not much," he admitted as they settled inside, "but it's hidden. They'd have to know exactly where to look." Eliza nodded, her breath forming clouds in the cold air of the cave. "How long can we stay here?" Mason considered the question. "Until dark, at least. Blackwood's not the type to give up easily, but he won't risk stumbling around these ravines at night." "And then we head east," Mason said, the decision made even as he spoke it. "Toward the sacred valley on your map. It's our best chance now." Eliza's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "You would still help me reach it? After all this?" Mason met her gaze steadily. "I gave my word." She studied his face, perhaps searching for hidden motives, then nodded once in acceptance. "Your arm needs better tending," she said, changing the subject. "Let me see." Mason removed his coat, carefully, wincing as the fabric pulled away from the wound. The bullet had carved a furrow along the outside of his upper arm, not deep enough to cause serious damage, but painful and bleeding steadily. Eliza examined it with practiced eyes, then retrieved the canteen from Mason's emergency supplies. She broke the ice inside by tapping it against the cave wall, then waited for a small amount to melt before using it to clean the wound. "It needs stitching," she said, "but this will have to do for now." She tore another strip from her already shortened shirt and bound the wound tightly. Her hands were gentle but firm, betraying experience with such injuries. "You've done this before," Mason observed. "Many times," she replied without looking up. "My mother was a healer. She taught me." "She taught you well." Eliza finished the bandage and sat back. "She died when the soldiers came. She was tending the wounded from the first volley when they shot her." The casual statement hit Mason like a physical blow. He closed his eyes briefly, memories flooding back the chaos of that day in Yellow Valley, the orders he had followed despite his misgivings, the faces of the Apache as they realized what was happening. "Eliza," he began, not sure what he was going to say, but knowing he needed to say something. She raised a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said quietly. "Whatever you're about to say, I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Mason insisted. "It's guilt," she suggested, her dark eyes studying him intently. "You speak of the army with such distance, as if you were never truly part of it." Mason felt the accusation in Eliza's words, even though her tone remained calm. She was piecing together what he hadn't yet confessed, his connection to the violence that had shattered her life. "What are you not telling me, Mason Sullivan?" she asked, her eyes never leaving his face. He looked away, first unable to meet her gaze. Outside the cave, the wind had picked up, whistling through the ravine. It would cover their voices, but also mask the approach of anyone tracking them. "There are things in my past," he began, then stopped. How could he tell her? How could he admit that he had been present at the massacre of her people? "We all have pasts," Eliza said, "some heavier than others." Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver medallion, holding it in his palm where she could see it. "Do you recognize this?" Eliza leaned forward, her breath catching as her eyes fell on the tarnished metal. Her hand moved toward it, then stopped, hovering inches away, as if she feared to touch it. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "Yellow Valley," Mason said the words, feeling like stones in his mouth. 5 years ago, Eliza's eyes snapped up to meet his sudden understanding dawning in them. "You were there," she said. It wasn't a question. Mason nodded, unable to speak. "You were one of the soldiers who killed my family." Again, not a question, but a statement of fact delivered with surprising calmness. "Yes," Mason admitted, the single word feeling inadequate against the weight of what he had done. Eliza sat very still, her face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the thoughts surely raging behind it. Only her eyes betrayed her, dark pools of pain so deep that Mason had to look away. "I found this medallion after," he continued. "I don't know why I took it. Maybe as a reminder of what happened, of what I was part of." "It belonged to my grandfather," Eliza said quietly. "He carried it always, a gift from his father before him." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken accusations and apologies that Mason knew would be meaningless. He waited for her anger, her hatred, her judgment, all of which he deserved. But when Eliza finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost distant. "Did you kill anyone that day?" Mason considered lying, offering her the comfort of believing his hands were clean. But she deserved the truth, however painful. "Yes, 2 men who tried to fight back. I was ordered to fire, and I did." She nodded slightly, absorbing this information without visible reaction. Were you the one who shot my father, my mother, my baby brother? I don't know, Mason answered honestly. It was chaos, smoke everywhere, people running. I can't say whose bullets found your family. Another silence longer this time. Mason weighted the medallion heavy in his palm. Finally, he held it out to her. It should be yours now. I've carried it too long. Eliza looked at the offered medallion, but didn't take it. Why did you help me? She asked instead. When I came to your door that night, why didn't you turn me away? It was a fair question, one Mason had asked himself repeatedly over the past 2 weeks. I told myself it was common decency, not leaving someone to freeze to death. He paused. But maybe I was looking for some kind of redemption. Redemption? Eliza repeated, testing the word. Do you think saving one Apache woman balances the scales for those you helped kill? No, Mason said without hesitation. Nothing balances those scales. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached out and took the medallion from his palm. Her fingers brushed his as she did, the brief contact sending an unexpected current through him. My people believe, she said, examining the medallion, that when someone dies, their spirit can become trapped between worlds if they have unfinished business. Perhaps this medallion stayed with you because my grandfather's spirit wanted it to find its way back to his family. Mason wasn't sure what to say to that, so he remained silent, watching as she ran her thumb over the etched surface of the silver disc. Did you know, she continued, her voice taking on a distant quality, that I was not there when the soldiers came. I had been sent to gather herbs in the hills. I heard the gunfire, saw the smoke, but I was too afraid to return until nightfall. Her eyes lifted to meet his. I found them all dead, my father, my mother, my little brother, who was only 5 summers old. The pain in her voice cut through Mason like a blade. I'm sorry, he said, knowing how hollow the words must sound. You say that often, Eliza observed, echoing her earlier comment. But now I understand why. She closed her fist around the medallion. You've been carrying this guilt for 5 years, longer than you've carried this silver. Mason couldn't deny it. The memories of Yellow Valley had haunted him since the day it happened. He had left the army shortly after, unable to reconcile what he had done with the man he wanted to be. After my wife and daughter died, he said, I thought maybe it was punishment for what I'd done, the universe balancing its scales. Eliza shook her head slightly. Sickness doesn't choose its victims based on past sins. It takes the innocent and guilty alike. Then why help me? Mason asked. Now that you know what I've done, why not take your chances out there without me? She considered the question seriously. Because surviving alone in this wilderness would be difficult, even for someone with my skills. Because Blackwood would hunt me whether you were with me or not. And because, she hesitated, seeming to search for the right words, because I believe people can change. It wasn't forgiveness. Mason knew better than to expect that, but it was something. A willingness to move forward, despite the blood-soaked past that connected them. We should rest while we can, Eliza said, tucking the medallion into her pocket. Night will come soon, and we have a long journey ahead. Mason nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. I'll take first watch, he offered. Eliza didn't argue, simply wrapping the small blanket around her shoulders and leaning back against the cave wall. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened, though Mason suspected she wasn't sleeping as deeply as she appeared. Outside, the day was waning, the shadows in the ravine growing longer. Mason positioned himself near the entrance of the cave, rifle ready across his knees. From this vantage, he could see a stretch of the ravine floor, though his view was partially obscured by the juniper growth that helped conceal their hiding place. As he kept watch, his mind returned to the conversation with Eliza. He had expected rage, accusation, perhaps even violence, when she learned of his role in the Yellow Valley massacre. Her relative calmness was unexpected, almost unsettling. Was she simply biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to exact revenge? Or had she truly meant what she said about people changing? Mason wasn't sure which possibility troubled him more. Revenge, he could understand. It followed a logic as old as humanity itself. But forgiveness, that was a concept he had long ago stopped believing in, especially for himself. The hours passed slowly, the temperature dropping as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains. Mason's wounded arm ached, a dull throbbing that intensified whenever he moved. He did his best to ignore it, focusing instead on scanning the ravine for any sign of pursuit. It was nearly dusk when he spotted movement, a flash of something dark against the snow about 200 yards downstream. Mason tensed, raising his rifle to get a better look through the scope. For several moments, nothing moved. Then he saw it again, a figure moving cautiously along the edge of the ravine, stopping frequently to examine the ground. Blackwood. Even at this distance, Mason recognized the bounty hunter's distinctive gait and the buffalo coat he wore. He was tracking them, following their trail through the snow. And if Blackwood was here, his men couldn't be far behind. Mason shifted position slightly to get a clearer shot, then hesitated. Killing a man in cold blood, even one like Blackwood, wasn't something he could do easily. Not anymore. And the sound of a rifle shot would echo through the ravine, potentially revealing their location to anyone else searching the area. He lowered the rifle and moved back from the cave entrance, crawling to where Eliza lay sleeping. Her eyes opened the moment he touched her shoulder, instantly alert. "Blackwood," Mason whispered, "downstream, following our trail." She sat up immediately, reaching for her pistol. "How close?" 200 yards, maybe less, by now. Moving slowly, checking the snow. Eliza processed this information quickly. "He'll find the cave eventually." Mason nodded grimly. "We need to move, now, while there's still some light." "Where?" Eliza asked, already gathering their meager supplies. "If we leave the ravine, we'll be exposed." "Up," Mason said, nodding toward the steep walls of the ravine. "The rock's harder there, less likely to hold tracks. If we can reach the ridge before full dark, we might be able to double back behind them." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best option they had. Quickly and silently, they prepared to move, checking their weapons and securing what few supplies they carried. Mason peered out of the cave once more, scanning for Blackwood. The bounty hunter had moved closer, now perhaps 150 yards away, still methodically examining the ravine floor. Soon he would find the place where they had climbed down and their footprints leading to the cave. "We go now," Mason whispered. "Stay low, move fast, and don't look back." Eliza nodded, her face set with determination. Together, they slipped out of the cave and into the gathering dusk, keeping to the shadows along the ravine wall. The climb ahead of them was steep, almost vertical in places, but there were enough handholds and ledges to make it possible if dangerous. Mason led the way, ignoring the pain in his wounded arm as he pulled himself up the rock face. Eliza followed close behind, moving with a natural agility that spoke of a lifetime navigating difficult terrain. They climbed in silence, each focused solely on the ascent, aware that a single misstep or dislodged rock could alert Blackwood to their position. They were perhaps halfway up the ravine wall when a shout echoed from below. Mason froze, pressing himself against the rock, and Eliza did the same. Cautiously, he peered over the edge. Blackwood stood at the mouth of the cave they had just vacated, rifle in hand, examining the disturbed snow where they had exited. He called out again, and this time Mason could make out the words. "Jenkins Mercer. Over here I've found their hiding place." From further up the ravine came answering calls, so Blackwood had at least 2 men with him, possibly more. The hunt was becoming more dangerous by the minute. "We need to move faster," Mason whispered to Eliza. "They know we were here." She nodded, and they resumed climbing, pushing their tired bodies to greater speed. The rock face grew steeper, the handholds fewer, but desperation lent them strength. Below, they could hear the men converging on the cave, their voices carrying in the still air of early evening. When they finally reached the top of the ravine, both were breathing hard muscles, trembling with exertion. They lay flat on their stomachs at the edge, peering down at the scene below. Blackwood and 2 other men, one Mason recognized as the pockmarked Jenkins from town, the other a stranger, were gathered outside the cave. They appeared to be arguing about which direction to take next, Blackwood gesturing upstream, while Jenkins pointed in the opposite direction. "They don't know we climbed out," Eliza observed quietly. "This gives us an advantage." Mason nodded. "We need to use it. Get as far away as possible before they figure it out." They withdrew from the edge and surveyed their surroundings. They were on a high plateau now, largely clear of trees, except for scattered pines. The snow stretched unbroken in all directions, silvery in the fading light. To the east, the direction of their intended journey, the land rose gradually toward distant mountains. "We'll leave tracks," Eliza said, stating the obvious concern. "Can't be helped," Mason replied. "But in the dark, they won't be able to follow easily. And if we're lucky, more snow will come before morning." The sky above was clear, however, offering little hope for fresh snowfall. Still, they had no choice but to move on. Standing, Mason winced as pain shot through his wounded arm. Eliza noticed immediately. "Your wound has opened again," she said, pointing to the fresh blood seeping through his bandage. "It can wait," Mason insisted. "We need distance now more than anything." She looked as if she might argue, then nodded reluctantly. "Which way?" Mason oriented himself, using the setting sun as reference. "East," he said, pointing across the plateau. "If we can reach those hills before dawn, we'll have better cover." They set off across the open ground, moving as quickly as the deep snow would allow. The temperature was dropping rapidly with the sun, the clear sky promising a bitter night ahead. Mason tried to ignore the cold seeping through his clothes, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other, on widening the gap between themselves and Blackwood. Eliza moved beside him, matching his pace despite her shorter stature. She seemed less affected by the cold, her movements more fluid, her breathing steadier. Mason found himself drawing strength from her resilience, from the quiet determination that radiated from her like heat from a fire. As darkness fell completely, the stars emerged countless points of light in the vast Montana sky. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to illuminate their way across the snow-covered plateau. It was beautiful in its way, this frozen wilderness, but Mason knew its beauty was deceptive. Out here exposed to the elements, they were vulnerable not just to Blackwood and his men, but to the merciless cold that had claimed countless lives before them. They had been walking for perhaps 2 hours, the hills to the east growing slowly larger, when Eliza suddenly stopped, her head turning like that of an animal catching a scent. "What is it?" Mason asked, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "Listen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason strained his ears at first, hearing nothing but the soft crunch of snow beneath their feet and the distant cry of a wolf. Then he caught it, a faint but unmistakable sound carried on the night air. the jingling of metal against metal, the sort of sound made by tack and bridle. "Horses," he breathed. Eliza nodded. "Coming from the south, moving fast." Mason scanned the moonlit landscape, seeking cover where there was none to be found. They stood exposed on the open plateau, their dark figures clearly visible against the white snow to anyone approaching. "Run," he said simply, and they did, abandoning caution for speed, plunging through the deep snow toward the distant hills. The sound of horses grew louder behind them. Mason risked a glance over his shoulder and saw them. 3 riders moving at a canter across the plateau, heading directly toward them. Even at this distance, he recognized Blackwood's distinctive silhouette in the lead. "They've spotted us," he called to Eliza, who was a few paces ahead. She didn't slow or look back, just increased her pace, her legs driving through the snow with remarkable power for someone her size. Mason pushed harder to keep up, his wounded arm throbbing in time with his pounding heart. The distance to the hills seemed impossibly vast, the horses gaining ground with every passing minute. Mason knew they couldn't outrun mounted pursuers, not in these conditions. They needed another solution, and quickly. The stream, Eliza suddenly veered left toward a dark line in the snow that Mason hadn't noticed before. A narrow watercourse mostly frozen over, but with patches of open water visible in the moonlight. Understanding her plan instantly, he followed. Water wouldn't hold tracks, and the stream might provide cover that the open plateau didn't. They reached the stream's edge just as the sound of hoofbeats grew dangerously close. Without hesitation, Eliza slid down the bank and onto the ice, Mason right behind her. The ice creaked ominously beneath their weight, but held. "Stay close to the bank," Mason advised, moving carefully along the frozen surface. "It's thicker there." Eliza nodded, keeping one hand on the snow-covered bank for balance as she moved downstream. Behind them, the riders had reached the spot where they had veered toward the stream. There was a brief pause, then shouts as they were spotted again. "Down!" Mason pulled Eliza into a crouch just as a rifle shot cracked through the night air. The bullet whined overhead, missing them by yards. "They can't shoot accurately from horseback," Mason said, "but they'll dismount soon enough." "Then we need to be gone before they do," Eliza replied, already moving again faster now, despite the treacherous footing. The stream curved ahead, bending around a small copse of trees that grew along its bank. If they could reach it, they'd be momentarily out of sight of their pursuers. "There," Mason pointed. "We get around that bend, then up and into those trees. Might throw them off long enough to gain some distance." Eliza nodded, and they increased their pace, the ice creaking and popping beneath their feet. Mason could hear the riders drawing closer, their horses' hooves thundering along the bank of the stream. Another shot rang out, this one closer, kicking up ice just feet from where they ran. They were nearly to the bend when disaster struck. A section of ice, weakened perhaps by the current beneath, or by their weight, gave way under Mason's foot. His leg plunged into frigid water up to the knee, the shock of the cold stealing his breath. He stumbled, would have fallen fully into the stream if Eliza hadn't grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Keep moving," she urged, helping him extract his leg from the broken ice. His boot and pant leg were instantly frozen, the wet cloth stiffening in the bitter cold. Every step was agony, but Mason pushed through it, knowing that to stop was to die either by Blackwood's bullet or by the killing cold of a Montana winter night. They rounded the bend just as another volley of shots rang out behind them. Without pausing, Eliza led the way up the stream bank and into the small grove of trees, the shadows swallowing them momentarily from view. "Keep going!" Mason gasped, pain shooting up his leg with each step. "Don't stop for me," Eliza ignored him, supporting him as they moved through the trees, her strength surprising for her size. "We stay together," she said firmly. "Like you said, in the cabin." Behind them, they could hear the riders reach the bend in the stream, their voices raised in confusion as they lost sight of their quarry. It wouldn't last long. The tracks leading up from the stream to the trees would be obvious once they looked, but it gave Mason and Eliza a brief respite, a chance to widen the gap. They emerged from the far side of the copse onto open ground once more, the hills now closer, perhaps a mile away. Mason's leg was beginning to lose feeling, which he knew was a dangerous sign. Frostbite could set in quickly, especially with wet clothing in these temperatures. "I need to stop," he said, hating the admission of weakness. "Just for a moment. Need to get this boot off. Try to dry it somehow." Eliza glanced back toward the trees, then at the distant hills. "There's no time," she said. "They'll be on us again in minutes." "If I don't, I'll lose the foot," Mason countered. "Won't do either of us any good then." She hesitated, then nodded. "Quickly then." They found a slight depression in the snow, a place where the wind had sculpted a shallow bowl. It wasn't much cover, but it was better than standing fully exposed. Mason dropped to the ground and began working at his frozen boot, his fingers clumsy with cold. Eliza knelt beside him, helping to unlace the stiff leather. Together, they managed to pull the boot from his foot, which was already alarming, pale, the toes waxy-looking in the moonlight. "Bad," Eliza said, simply examining the foot. "Need to warm it now." Without hesitation, she unwrapped her scarf from around her neck and began briskly rubbing Mason's foot, trying to stimulate circulation. The pain as feeling returned was excruciating, but Mason bit down on his lip, knowing it was necessary. "Your sock," Eliza said. "Take it off." Mason complied, wincing as the wet wool peeled away from his skin. Eliza immediately removed one of her own socks. She wore two on each foot, he noticed, and handed it to him. "Put this on, it's dry." "You'll freeze," Mason protested. "I've lived in colder with less," she replied simply. "Do it." He couldn't argue with her logic, so he pulled the offered sock over his half-frozen foot. It was small and stretched tight, but it was dry and still warm from her body heat. Eliza, meanwhile, wrung as much water as possible from his boot, then held it near his foot. "Can you put it back on?" she asked. Mason nodded, though the thought of encasing his foot in the frozen leather again was daunting. With Eliza's help, he managed to work the boot back on, lacing it as loosely as possible to allow for circulation. Just as he finished, the sound of hoofbeats reached them again. The riders had found their trail and were emerging from the trees. "No more time," Eliza said, helping Mason to his feet. "Can you run?" He tested his weight on the affected foot. It was painful, but functional. "Yes." They set off again toward the hills, Mason gritting his teeth against the pain that shot up his leg with each step. Behind them, the riders had spotted them, again their shouts carrying across the open ground. The race resumed, but the outcome seemed increasingly inevitable. 3 men on horseback against 2 on foot, one of them injured. "We're not going to make it to the hills," Mason said, his breath coming in harsh gasps. "Need another plan." Eliza scanned the terrain ahead, searching for any advantage. "There," she said, suddenly pointing to a dark patch in the snow about a quarter-mile ahead. "Rocks. If we can reach them, we might have a fighting chance." Mason saw it now, a cluster of boulders protruding from the snow, likely the remains of some ancient rockfall from the hills beyond. It wasn't much, but it offered cover, a place to make a stand if it came to that. They altered course slightly, angling toward the rocks. The riders adjusted as well, trying to cut them off. It would be close. Mason's wounded arm and half-frozen foot slowed him, but determination drove him forward. Eliza stayed by his side, though he knew she could have moved faster without him. Her loyalty, especially now that she knew his darkest secret, continued to surprise him. The rocks were perhaps 100 yards away when the first rider, Jenkins, the pockmarked man from town, drew alongside them, cutting across their path. He reined his horse to a halt and dismounted quickly, rifle raised. "That's far enough, Sullivan," he called. "Next step gets a bullet." Mason and Eliza stopped, both breathing hard. Mason shifted slightly, putting himself between Eliza and Jenkins's rifle. "Where's Blackwood?" Mason called back, playing for time as he assessed their options. The other two riders were still behind them, approaching at a slower pace now that Jenkins had intercepted them. "Right here, Sullivan," came the reply as Blackwood himself rode up, dismounting, with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to life in the saddle. The third rider, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, remained mounted, his rifle trained on them from horseback. "You've led us on quite a chase," Blackwood continued, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Impressive, considering your condition." His eyes flicked to Mason's blood-stained sleeve and the awkward way he favored his right foot. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Mason demanded, though he knew the answer well enough. "Don't play stupid, Sullivan. I want what belongs to my employer, the Apache woman and the map she stole." Blackwood's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Hand them over, and you might walk away from this." "She's not property," Mason said, "and she didn't steal anything." Blackwood sighed as if dealing with a particularly slow child. "This moral stand is admirable, but misplaced. The woman killed a man and took something of value that wasn't hers. These are facts, not matters of opinion." "She didn't kill anyone," Mason insisted, "and whatever she took, she had a right to." "A right?" Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "What right does an Apache have to anything in this territory, especially something as valuable as a map to gold beside Mason?" Eliza tensed at the mention of gold, so Blackwood knew or thought he knew what the map showed. "There's no gold," she said, speaking for the first time. "The map leads to sacred healing grounds, nothing more." Blackwood laughed, the sound echoing across the snowy landscape. "A clever lie, but a lie nonetheless. We found the Apache man you were traveling with, before you killed him. He told us exactly what that map shows before he died." Mason felt Eliza flinch beside him. "You're the murderers, not her," he said, his anger rising. "You killed her companion and blamed her for it." "Semantics," Blackwood dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The point is, I'm being paid to retrieve both the woman and the map, and I intend to do exactly that." He stepped forward, hand extended. "The map, Sullivan, now." Mason's hand moved to his rifle, but Jenkins and the mounted man both adjusted their aim, making it clear that any sudden movement would be his last. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in no position to fight. Eliza seemed to reach the same conclusion. She moved forward, reaching into her pocket. "I'll give you the map," she said, her voice steady. "But then you let Mason go." "Eliza, no." Mason started to protest, but she silenced him with a look. "It's over, Mason," she said quietly. "You've done enough." Blackwood smiled, satisfaction evident in his cold eyes. "A wise decision," he told Eliza. "The map, if you please." Slowly, deliberately, Eliza withdrew something from her pocket. But it wasn't the folded leather packet containing the map. It was the silver medallion Mason had returned to her in the cave. Before anyone could react, she flung it directly at Blackwood's face. The bounty hunter flinched instinctively, raising his hands to protect himself. In that split second of distraction, Eliza moved with startling speed, drawing the small knife from her boot and lunging toward Blackwood. Jenkins shouted a warning and fired, but his aim was hasty, the bullet going wide. Mason seized the opportunity, raising his rifle and firing at the mounted man, who tumbled from his horse with a cry of pain. Blackwood had recovered quickly, blocking Eliza's knife thrust and grabbing her wrist. They struggled briefly before he twisted her arm, forcing her to drop the blade. But Eliza was not so easily subdued. She drove her knee up into Blackwood's groin, causing him to double over in pain. Mason turned his rifle on Jenkins, who was frantically trying to reload after his missed shot. "Drop it," Mason commanded, and after a moment's hesitation, Jenkins complied, the rifle falling to the snow at his feet. The momentary victory was short-lived. Blackwood, despite being in pain, managed to draw a pistol from inside his coat. He grabbed Eliza, pulling her roughly against him as a shield, the gun pressed to her temple. "Enough!" he shouted. "Drop the rifle, Sullivan, or I put a bullet in her head right now." Mason hesitated, his rifle still trained on Jenkins, but his eyes on Blackwood and Eliza. The bounty hunter's face was contorted with anger, his finger tight on the trigger of the pistol. "Don't do it, Mason," Eliza said, her voice remarkably calm despite the gun at her head. "He'll kill us both anyway." "Shut up!" Blackwood snarled, pressing the gun harder against her temple. "Last chance, Sullivan." "Drop it." Mason knew she was right. Blackwood had no reason to let either of them live once he had the map. But he couldn't stand by and watch Eliza die, not when he had the power to prevent it, even if only for a moment longer. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his rifle. "On the ground," Blackwood ordered. "Now." Mason placed the rifle in the snow, his mind racing for a way out of this deadly impasse. Jenkins quickly retrieved his own weapon and moved to cover Mason, his pockmarked face twisted in a vindictive grin. "Should have taken the money when I offered it," Blackwood told Mason, still keeping Eliza firmly in his grip. "Now, you get nothing but a cold grave in the snow." "The map first," Mason said, playing for time. "You still need that, don't you?" Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Where is it?" "I have it," Mason lied. "Hidden. You kill either of us, you'll never find it." It was a desperate bluff, but it seemed to give Blackwood pause. He studied Mason's face, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. "You're lying," he decided. "She has it. The Apache girl wouldn't trust something that valuable to a white man, especially not one who used to hunt her kind." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. How did Blackwood know about his military service? Had he asked questions in town after Mason left? "I don't have it," Eliza said. "I gave it to him for safekeeping." Her quick uptake of the lie impressed Mason, though he doubted it would fool Blackwood for long. "Search him," Blackwood ordered Jenkins, who moved forward with his rifle still trained on Mason. The pockmarked man patted Mason down roughly, checking his pockets, his boots, even the bandage on his arm, which he probed painfully enough to make Mason gasp. "Nothing," Jenkins reported, stepping back. "No map." Blackwood's face darkened with anger. "Where is it, Sullivan? And don't bother leeing. My patience is at an end." "Oh, hidden," Mason insisted. "Back at the cabin before you burned it down." "Impossible," Blackwood spat. "You didn't know we were coming. You wouldn't have had time to hide it." "I didn't trust you from the moment I met you in town," Mason countered. "I took precautions." The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed as he considered this. "Jenkins," he said after a moment, "go check the third man. See if he's still alive." Jenkins nodded and moved away to where the mounted man had fallen, leaving Blackwood alone with his hostage and Mason. "Here's what's going to happen," Blackwood said, his voice returning to its earlier calm. "You're going to tell me exactly where that map is hidden, or I start hurting the girl. Nothing fatal at first, maybe just a finger or an ear, but I promise you she'll suffer considerably before I'm done." The casual brutality of the threat made Mason's blood run cold. He glanced at Eliza, whose face remained remarkably composed despite the danger. There was something in her eyes, though. Not fear, but a message, a silent communication he struggled to interpret. "Well?" Blackwood prompted, shifting his grip on Eliza slightly to maintain control as she made a small, seemingly involuntary movement. It was then that Mason understood. Eliza was positioning herself, preparing for something. He needed to keep Blackwood talking, keep his attention focused on the conversation rather than on his captive. "The map is in a waterproof pouch," Mason said, inventing details to make the lie more convincing. "Buried beneath the large pine tree behind where my cabin stood. 3 feet down, marked with a stone cairn." Blackwood looked skeptical. "Why go to such lengths to hide it?" "Because I knew its value," Mason replied. "Not for gold, but for Eliza's people. It's their heritage, their sacred place. I wanted to protect it." "How touching," Blackwood sneered. "A former Indian fighter protecting Apache heritage. Almost poetic if it weren't so pathetic." So he did know about Mason's military past. That explained some of the bounty hunter's confidence. He saw Mason as a hypocrite, a man without firm convictions who could be manipulated or intimidated. "Jenkins," Blackwood called, without taking his eyes off Mason. "Report?" There was no answer from where Jenkins had gone to check on the fallen rider. Blackwood's expression tightened with annoyance and the first flickers of concern. "Jenkins!" he called again, louder this time. The momentary distraction was all Eliza needed. In a move so swift Mason barely saw it, she drove her elbow back into Blackwood's ribs with surprising force. The bounty hunter grunted in pain, his grip on her loosening just enough for her to twist away from the gun at her temple. Mason lunged for his discarded rifle, but Blackwood recovered quickly, swinging his pistol toward him. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, the sounds cracking across the snowy plateau like breaking ice. Mason felt a searing pain across his side as Blackwood's bullet grazed him. But the bounty hunter had fared worse. Blood bloomed suddenly on his shoulder, spinning him half around with the impact. The second shot hadn't come from Blackwood's pistol. Mason turned to see Jenkins crumpled in the snow where he had gone to check the third rider. Standing over him was Eliza Jenkins's own rifle in her hands, still smoking in the cold air. Blackwood, despite his wound, tried to bring his pistol to bear again. Mason didn't give him the chance. He fired once, the bullet taking the bounty hunter in the chest. Blackwood staggered, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face before he collapsed to his knees, then fell forward into the snow. Silence descended on the plateau, broken only by the harsh breathing of the survivors and the distant howl of a wolf. Mason approached Blackwood cautiously, rifle ready, but the bounty hunter was beyond threatening anyone. His eyes stared sightlessly at the star-filled sky, his blood turning the snow beneath him a dark crimson. "Are you hit?" Eliza asked, moving quickly to Mason's side. "Just a graze," he assured her, though his side burned like fire where the bullet had cut across it. "You—" She shook her head. "I'm unharmed." She glanced at the bodies of Blackwood and Jenkins, her expression unreadable. "The third man, dead before I got to him," she confirmed. "Your shot was true." Mason nodded, feeling no satisfaction in the killing, just a grim relief that they had survived. "We should go," he said, "in case there are others." Eliza agreed, but first moved to retrieve something from Blackwood's coat, her silver medallion which had fallen into the snow during their struggle. As she tucked it away, her hand paused, then withdrew something else from the bounty hunter's pocket, a folded piece of paper. She examined it briefly, then handed it to Mason. It was a telegram dated a week earlier addressed to Thaddeus Blackwood, Apache woman Eliza Reed, escaped vicinity St. David. Stop believed heading north with map to gold mine. Stop reward $1,000 for return of map and woman alive. Stop. Signed Colonel James Hargrove, Fort Benton. Stop. Hargrove. Mason breathed the name, hitting him like a physical blow. My God. You know this man? Eliza asked, watching his face carefully. Mason nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Colonel Hargrove was my commanding officer at Yellow Valley. Understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes. Then it was not coincidence that you found me. The man who ordered the death of my people now hunts me again, using you as his unwitting tool. I had no idea, Mason insisted. I left the army years ago. Haven't had contact with Hargrove or anyone from that time since. Eliza studied his face, perhaps searching for deception. Apparently satisfied with what she saw, she nodded once. I believe you, but this changes things. If Hargrove is involved, he will send more men when Blackwood doesn't return. Mason knew she was right. James Hargrove was not a man who accepted failure, and he was certainly not one to let valuable property, as he would see both Eliza and the map, slip through his fingers. All the more reason to reach the sacred valley quickly, Mason said. Get you safely to your people. Us, Eliza corrected. Get us safely there. You're part of this now, whether you wished it or not. The inclusion surprised Mason, especially given what she now knew about his connection to Hargrove and the massacre at Yellow Valley. You still want me with you, even knowing what I was part of? Eliza's expression softened slightly. What you were part of, yes. Not what you are now. She gestured to the bodies in the snow. You have chosen your side, Mason Sullivan, as have I. We go forward together. It wasn't forgiveness. Mason knew better than to expect or ask for that, but it was acceptance, an acknowledgement that the past, while never forgotten, need not dictate the future. It was more than he deserved, but he accepted it with quiet gratitude. They gathered what supplies they could from Blackwood and his men. Ammunition, food, a compass, and most valuable of all, 2 horses. The third had bolted during the gunfire and was nowhere to be seen. As they mounted, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first pale glow of dawn, touching the distant mountains. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay the sacred valley Eliza sought, and with it perhaps redemption for them both. How far? Mason asked, adjusting himself in the saddle to accommodate his wounded side. 3 days' ride, Eliza estimated, scanning the horizon. Less if the weather holds and we push hard. Mason nodded. Then we push hard. Hargrove won't be waiting patiently at Fort Benton for news. With that, they turned the horses eastward and rode away from the scene of bloodshed, leaving Blackwood and his men to the mercy of the Montana winter and whatever scavengers might find them. The map to the sacred valley remained safely tucked away in Eliza's clothing, its secret intact for now. But as they rode toward the rising sun, both knew that their journey was far from over, and the dangers they had faced thus far might pale in comparison to what lay ahead. The dawn broke cold and clear over the Montana wilderness, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Mason and Eliza rode eastward in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, as they put distance between themselves and the bodies they had left behind. Mason's side burned where Blackwood's bullet had grazed him, and his half-frozen foot throbbed with each movement of the horse beneath him. But these physical discomforts paled in comparison to the turmoil in his mind. The revelation that Colonel Hargrove, his former commanding officer, and the man who had ordered the massacre at Yellow Valley was behind the hunt for Eliza had reopened wounds Mason had spent 5 years trying to heal. Beside him, Eliza rode with the natural grace of someone who had grown up on horseback. Her face was composed, revealing nothing of her thoughts, but Mason could sense the tension in her shoulders, the vigilance with which she scanned the horizon. She had survived the worst the world could throw at her, and yet she persisted, driven by a determination that Mason found himself admiring more with each passing hour. As the sun climbed higher, they crested a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the terrain ahead. To the east, the land rose gradually toward a range of mountains, their peaks sharp against the winter sky. Between their current position and those distant summits lay a vast expanse of rolling hills and frozen valleys, occasionally broken by stands of pine and aspen. Eliza reined her horse to a halt and surveyed the landscape with a critical eye. "We need to avoid open ground as much as possible," she said, breaking the long silence. "Hargrove will send more men when Blackwood doesn't report back." Mason nodded, wincing slightly, as the movement sent a jolt of pain through his wounded side. The colonel was never one to accept failure. If the map is as valuable as he believes, he'll spare no expense to retrieve it. "And me?" Eliza added, her voice flat. The telegram specified "woman alive." "Why does he want you?" Mason asked. "If it's just the map he's after, I'm the only one who can read it properly," Eliza explained. "The markings are in an old Apache dialect, one few would recognize. Without me, the map is just paper with strange symbols." Mason understood then the full extent of Hargrove's ruthlessness. The colonel hadn't just sent Blackwood to retrieve stolen property. He had sent him to recapture a person he saw as a tool, a means to an end. "We'll stay to the tree lines where possible," Mason decided, studying the terrain ahead. "Follow creek beds when we have to cross open ground. It'll slow us down but make us harder to track." Eliza nodded in agreement. "There's a river ahead," she said, pointing to a dark line snaking through the distant valley. "If we can reach it by midday, we can follow it into the foothills. The water will hide our trail." They urged their horses forward, descending from the ridge into a sparse forest of lodgepole pines. The animals moved carefully through the deep snow, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Mason found himself constantly scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit. "How well do you know Hargrove?" Eliza asked after a while, breaking the silence again. Mason considered the question before answering. "Well enough. I served under him for 4 years before Yellow Valley. He was—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Effective, ruthless when he needed to be, respected but not liked. And after Yellow Valley, I requested a transfer immediately. Cited family reasons, my wife was ill. The colonel granted it, though not without making his disappointment clear. He expected his men to follow orders without question, especially the scouts." "You questioned the orders at Yellow Valley." Eliza's voice held a note of surprise. Mason's hands tightened on the reins. "Not loudly enough," he admitted. "Not when it would have mattered. I had doubts. We all did. The intelligence claiming your band was harboring hostiles was thin at best. But we followed orders anyway. And people died," Eliza said simply, without accusation. "Yes," Mason agreed, the single word heavy with regret. "People died." They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the creaking of saddle leather and the soft crunching of snow beneath the horses' hooves. The sun climbed higher, but provided little warmth against the bitter cold. Mason found himself studying Eliza's profile as she rode beside him. There was a strength in her that went beyond physical endurance, a spiritual resilience that had allowed her to survive horrors that would have broken many others. And yet, despite everything she had endured at the hands of men like him, she had chosen to trust him to accept his help. "Why didn't you kill me?" he asked suddenly, the question that had been nagging at him since she discovered his involvement in Yellow Valley. "In the cave when you learned who I was, what I'd done, You had every right. Eliza turned to look at him directly, her dark eyes unreadable. Would my knife in your heart bring my family back? Would your blood restore my village? No, Mason admitted, but it might have given you justice, or at least vengeance. She was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. There has been enough death, she said finally. My people believe that a life taken in anger binds both spirits, the killer and the killed, in a cycle that continues beyond death. I don't wish to be bound to any more ghosts. Mason absorbed this, humbled by the wisdom in her words. And yet, we've both killed since then. Blackwood and his men. That was survival, Eliza replied. Not vengeance. There is a difference. Before Mason could respond, she suddenly raised a hand, signaling him to stop. He reined in his horse immediately, every sense on alert. What is it? He whispered, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. Eliza pointed ahead and slightly to their right. Smoke. Mason followed her gaze and saw it, a thin column of smoke rising above the trees, perhaps a half-mile distant. Someone had made camp nearby, which could mean trouble. Could be trappers, Mason suggested, though he didn't believe it. Few honest men would be out in this weather this far from settlements. Or more of Hargrove's men, Eliza countered. Either way, we should avoid them. Mason nodded in agreement. We'll swing wide to the south, try to circle around them. They altered course, guiding their horses through a denser part of the forest where the snow was shallower beneath the pine canopy. Moving as quietly as possible, they gave the source of the smoke a wide berth. It was as they were passing the southernmost point of their detour that Mason caught a glimpse of movement through the trees, the unmistakable silhouette of a mounted man moving parallel to their course. "Rider!" he hissed to Eliza, who immediately guided her horse behind a large pine for cover. Mason did the same, both of them watching intently as the figure passed perhaps 100 yards to their south. The man wore an army greatcoat and campaign hat, a cavalry scout by the look of him. He moved with purpose, clearly following a trail rather than making a random patrol. "He's tracking us," Eliza whispered, once the rider had passed out of sight. "Following our trail from where we left Blackwood." Mason nodded grimly. "And if there's one scout, there are likely more. Possibly a full patrol." "How many?" "Standard patrol would be 6 men. But if Hargrove is serious about finding us, he might have sent a full company." Eliza's expression remained calm, but Mason saw the tightening of her jaw at this news. "We need to move faster," she said. "Reach the river before they close in." They urged their horses forward at a quicker pace, balancing the need for speed against the risk of making noise. The forest grew thinner as they descended into a broad valley, the promised river visible now as a dark ribbon cutting through the snow-covered landscape. They had just emerged from the tree line when a shot rang out behind them, the bullet whistling overhead to embed itself in a distant trunk. "Ride!" Mason shouted, kicking his horse into a gallop. They broke cover, racing across the open ground toward the river. Behind them, more shots sounded, though none came as close as the first. Mason risked a glance over his shoulder and saw 3 riders emerging from the forest, giving chase at full speed. "Keep going," he called to Eliza. "Don't stop until you reach the water." The horses plunged through the deep snow, their powerful legs driving them forward despite the difficult terrain. Mason's mount was beginning to tire its pace, slowing as the snow grew deeper near the riverbank. Eliza, being lighter, had pulled slightly ahead. Another volley of shots rang out closer this time. Mason felt his horse shudder beneath him as a bullet found its mark. The animal staggered, then recovered, but its stride was labored now. "He's hit!" Mason called to Eliza, who was already at the river's edge. "Go on, I'll hold them off." She turned back, hesitating only a moment before guiding her horse into the shallow water at the river's edge. "Follow the river east," she called back. "I'll wait for you at the fork." Mason nodded, then swung down from his wounded horse. The animal was still on its feet, but bleeding heavily from a wound in its flank. It wouldn't carry him much further. He gave it a gentle slap on the rump, sending it stumbling toward the tree line away from the approaching riders. Taking cover behind a fallen log near the riverbank, Mason readied his rifle. The three riders were closing fast, perhaps 200 yards away now. He took careful aim at the lead horse and fired. The shot found its mark, the horse going down in a tangle of limbs that sent its rider tumbling into the snow. The other two riders immediately veered off, seeking cover among a stand of cottonwoods near the valley floor. Mason used the opportunity to move closer to the river, keeping low, and using what little cover the barren landscape provided. He fired again when one of the riders showed himself briefly, the shot going wide, but forcing the man back into cover. Reaching the riverbank, Mason waded into the shallow water. The cold was immediate and shocking, but he gritted his teeth against it and began moving downstream, keeping his rifle above the water. The river was mostly frozen, but a channel of open water ran down its center, the current swift enough to prevent complete freezing. He had gone perhaps 50 yards when shots rang out again from the bank behind him. One bullet struck the ice near his feet, sending up a spray of water and frozen shards. Mason quickened his pace, moving as fast as the slippery footing would allow. Ahead, the river curved around a bend, which would provide temporary cover from the shooters on the bank. Mason pushed harder, ignoring the numbing cold of the water that reached mid-calf. Just as he approached the bend, a final shot cracked across the valley. Pain exploded in his left shoulder as the bullet found its mark, spinning him half around. Mason staggered, but kept his feet, the momentum carrying him around the river bend and out of the shooter's line of sight. Blood spread across his coat sleeve, hot at first, then quickly cooling in the frigid air. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he continued downstream, each step an exercise in willpower. The river narrowed as it entered a small canyon, the banks rising steeply on either side. This was both good and bad. It provided cover from pursuit, but also left him with no easy way out should the soldiers follow him into the water. Mason continued for what felt like an eternity, the cold water and blood loss gradually sapping his strength. His wounded shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and his previously frozen foot had gone completely numb. He knew he couldn't continue much longer without rest and treatment for his wounds. The canyon widened, eventually opening into another valley, where the river split into two channels around a small wooded island. On the far bank, partially concealed among the trees, Mason spotted Eliza's horse. "Eliza," he called, his voice weaker than he had intended. She emerged from the trees, immediately leading her horse down to the water's edge. When she saw his bloody shoulder, her expression tightened with concern. "Can you make it across?" she called. Mason nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. The main channel between him and the island looked deep, the current swift beneath a thin layer of ice. But to stay on his side of the river meant certain capture or death. He stepped carefully into the deeper water, gasping as the cold reached his waist. The current pulled at him, threatening to sweep his weakened body downstream. Each step was a battle of will against the combined forces of nature and his failing strength. Midway across, his foot slipped on a submerged rock, plunging him briefly beneath the surface. The shock of the icy water closing over his head nearly caused him to gasp, which would have meant drawing water into his lungs. With desperate strength, he regained his footing and pushed on, breaking the surface with a ragged breath. Eliza had waded in from the other side, reaching out to him. Their hands met in the middle of the channel, her grip surprisingly strong as she helped guide him to shallower water. Once on the island, Mason collapsed to his knees, shivering violently as the wind cut through his soaked clothing. Eliza worked quickly, helping him to the shelter of the trees, where she had already started a small, nearly smokeless fire. "We can't stay long," she said as she helped him remove his frozen outer garments, "but you'll die without warming first." Mason couldn't argue. He could barely speak through his chattering teeth. The bullet wound in his shoulder was still bleeding, though the cold had slowed the flow considerably. Eliza examined it with a critical eye. "Clean through," she announced. "Missed the bone. You're lucky." "Doesn't feel lucky." Mason managed his entire body shaking uncontrollably. Eliza worked efficiently, tearing strips from her own undershirt to bind the wound. Then she wrapped him in the single blanket they had taken from Blackwood's supplies, positioning him as close to the small fire as was safe. "Rest," she said. "I'll watch." Mason wanted to protest, to insist that they needed to keep moving, but his body had reached its limit. The combined effects of cold blood loss and exhaustion dragged him toward unconsciousness. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Eliza's face, firelight dancing across her features as she maintained her vigil. Mason awoke to the sound of water dripping from tree branches. For a moment, he was disoriented, uncertain where he was or how much time had passed. The small fire had burned down to embers, but he was no longer cold. In fact, he felt uncomfortably warm. Eliza appeared at his side, immediately placing a cool hand on his forehead. "Fever," she said, her voice tight with concern. "The wound is infected." Mason tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back down. "How long was I out?" "Hours. It's nearly sunset." He processed this with alarm. "We need to move. The soldiers—" "I've been watching," Eliza assured him. "Two came downstream as far as the canyon, but turned back when the light began to fail. They'll resume the search at dawn." Mason nodded, relieved they had at least the cover of night. "We should go soon, then. Use the darkness to our advantage." Eliza's expression was troubled. "You're in no condition to travel." I'll manage," Mason insisted, though he wasn't at all certain he could. The pain in his shoulder had intensified, and there was a worrying numbness spreading down his arm. "What matters is getting you to the sacred valley." "What matters is both of us surviving," Eliza countered firmly. "I need herbs to treat your wound properly, to bring down the fever." "Where would you find herbs in winter?" "The sacred valley," she replied. "That's why it's sacred. The hot springs keep the ground warm year-round. Plants grow there even in the deepest winter." Mason understood her dilemma: push forward to reach the healing plants, risking his condition worsening during travel, or delay to let him rest, risking capture by Hargrove's men. "How far?" he asked. 2 days' ride if we had both horses, longer on foot, or sharing one mount." Mason considered their options, limited as they were. "We ride," he decided. "Together. Your horse can carry us both for a while at least." Eliza didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "I made a poultice from pine resin for your wound. It will help fight the infection until we reach the valley." She helped him sit up, then carefully removed the blood-soaked bandage from his shoulder. The wound looked angry, the flesh around it red and swollen. With gentle hands, Eliza applied a sticky, strong-smelling paste to both the entry and exit wounds, then bound them with fresh bandages torn from her dwindling supply of fabric. "Your clothes are still damp," she observed. "We need to find you something dry to wear." Mason looked down at his half-frozen garments, knowing she was right. Wet clothes in these temperatures would kill him as surely as any bullet. "Blackwood's coat," he suggested. "We took it from his body." Eliza retrieved the buffalo coat from where their meager supplies were piled. The garment was heavy and stiff with dried blood. Blackwood's blood, but it was warm and dry. Mason suppressed his revulsion as Eliza helped him into it. Survival trumped squeamishness out here. By the time they were ready to depart, night had fully fallen. The sky was clear stars shining with crystalline brilliance in the black vault above. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to see by, turning the snow-covered landscape into a silvery dreamscape. Eliza helped Mason onto her horse, then mounted behind him. The arrangement was awkward. The saddle wasn't designed for two riders, but it would have to do. Mason's fever was worsening, making him light-headed and unsteady. Having Eliza behind him, her arms around his waist to hold the reins, was the only way he would stay mounted. They set off eastward, following the river, which Eliza explained would eventually lead them to a pass through the mountains. The horse moved slowly under their combined weight, picking its way carefully through the snow-covered terrain. "Tell me about the sacred valley," Mason said after a while, partly to keep himself alert, partly because he genuinely wanted to know. Eliza was quiet for a moment, perhaps deciding how much to share. "It is a place of healing," she said finally, "hidden deep in the mountains where the white man's maps don't reach. The earth breathes there, releasing steam that carries the scent of minerals. Pools of water bubble up hot enough to steam even in winter. And your people, they're there." "Some, perhaps," Eliza replied, a note of uncertainty in her voice. "After Yellow Valley, those who escaped fled in different directions. Some went south, others west, but many followed the old ways, seeking refuge in the sacred places." "And if they're not there," Mason asked gently, "if no one survived," Eliza's arms tightened slightly around his waist, "then I will be the keeper of the valley, the last one who remembers." The quiet dignity in her voice moved Mason deeply. He understood now why she had risked so much to retrieve and protect the map. It wasn't just a path to a physical location, but to her heritage, her identity, perhaps the last remnant of her people's history. They rode through the night, stopping occasionally to rest the horse and to check Mason's condition, which was steadily worsening. The fever made him alternately burning hot and shivering cold, and at times he found himself drifting, losing track of where he was or who was with him. During one such episode, he called out for Catherine, his dead wife, believing for a moment that she was the one holding him upright on the horse. Eliza's voice brought him back to reality, her calm instructions to drink water to stay awake anchoring him to the present. Dawn found them at the base of the mountains, the pass Eliza sought visible as a notch in the otherwise unbroken ridge. The horse was showing signs of exhaustion, its head hanging low, its pace reduced to a plodding walk. They would need to rest soon, both for the animal's sake and for Mason's increasingly precarious condition. Eliza guided them to a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging cliff where a stand of junipers provided some concealment. She helped Mason dismount, supporting most of his weight, as his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. "We'll rest for a few hours," she decided, helping him sit with his back against the rock face. "The horse needs it, and so do you." Mason didn't argue. He could feel his strength ebbing, the infection in his wound spreading its poison through his system. Without proper treatment soon, he knew his chances of survival were slim. Eliza cared for the horse first, removing its saddle and rubbing it down with handfuls of dry grass she found beneath the snow. Then she turned her attention to Mason, checking his wound and frowning at what she found. "It's worse," she said simply. "We need to reach the valley today." And Mason nodded, though he wondered privately if he would make it that far. How far to the pass? 3 hours' ride. Another 2 beyond that to the valley. 5 hours. It might as well have been 5 days in his current condition. But he wouldn't say that to Eliza, wouldn't burden her with his doubts. "I'll make it," he promised. She studied his face, perhaps seeing the lie there, but chose not to challenge it. Instead, she helped him drink some water, then settled beside him, sharing her body heat, as they both dozed in the weak morning sun. Mason's sleep was troubled by fever dreams, disjointed images of Yellow Valley of Blackwood's dying face, of Catherine and their daughter lying pale and still in their sickness. And through it all, Eliza's voice, sometimes distant, sometimes close, guiding him back from the brink of delirium. When Eliza woke him, the sun had climbed higher, though it provided little warmth in the mountain air. Mason's fever had neither improved nor worsened during their rest, a small mercy, though the respite would be temporary without proper treatment. "The horse is rested," Eliza said. "We should continue." With her help, Mason managed to stand, though the world swam alarmingly around him. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on reaching the horse, on allowing Eliza to help him mount. Each small victory required immense concentration. They set off toward the pass, the terrain growing steeper and more difficult. The horse struggled in places where the snow had drifted deep, and Eliza was forced to dismount and lead it through the worst sections. Mason clung to the saddle, using all his remaining strength just to stay upright. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, making breathing more labored. Mason's fever seemed to worsen with the altitude, his thoughts becoming increasingly disconnected. At times, he wasn't sure if he was awake or dreaming, if the voice urging him to hold on was Eliza's or some phantom from his past. The pass itself was a narrow defile between towering rock faces, barely wide enough for the horse to navigate. The wind howled through it, carrying ice crystals that stung the skin like tiny needles. Eliza led the way, the horse picking its way carefully over the rocky ground, Mason swaying in the saddle with each step. When they emerged on the eastern side of the pass, the landscape opened up before them, a vast rugged wilderness of deep valleys and sharp ridges untouched by human development. In the distance, a thin column of what appeared to be smoke rose from one of the valleys, though Mason's fevered mind registered that its color was strange, more white than gray. "The Sacred Valley," Eliza said, pointing to the source of the steam. "We're close." Mason tried to respond, but found he couldn't form the words. The world was growing dim around the edges, sounds becoming muffled as if heard underwater. He was vaguely aware of sliding from the saddle, of Eliza's alarmed cry, of the cold snow against his face. Then darkness claimed him once more. Warmth. That was the first sensation Mason registered as consciousness slowly returned. Not the burning heat of fever, but a gentle, encompassing warmth that seemed to seep into his very bones. The air he breathed carried an unfamiliar scent, mineral-rich, slightly sulphurous, but not unpleasant. He opened his eyes to find himself in a small dome-shaped structure. Light filtered through the covering overhead, suggesting it was made of some kind of translucent material. Animal hides, perhaps stretched thin. He lay on a bed of soft furs, his upper body bare, except for fresh bandages around his wounded shoulder. "You're awake," said a familiar voice. Mason turned his head to see Eliza sitting beside him, grinding something in a small stone mortar. She looked different, cleaner, her hair neatly braided, wearing what appeared to be a traditional Apache dress, rather than the borrowed clothes she'd worn during their journey. "Where?" Mason's voice was a rasp, his throat dry. "The Sacred Valley," Eliza answered, setting aside her work to help him drink from a clay cup filled with cool water. "We made it." Mason drank gratefully, the water soothing his parched throat. As his mind cleared, questions multiplied. "How long have I been unconscious?" "3 days," Eliza replied. "Your fever broke last night. I wasn't sure you would survive." 3 days. Mason tried to process this, to fill in the blank space in his memory. "How did you get me here? I remember falling from the horse." "I didn't," Eliza said, a small smile touching her lips. My people found us. This revelation stunned Mason. Your people, they're here. Eliza nodded. A small band, 28 in all. They fled here after Yellow Valley just as I had hoped. They've been living here since hidden from the world. Relief washed over Mason, not just for his own survival, but for Eliza's sake. Her journey, her desperate flight from captivity, her protection of the map, it had all been worthwhile. She had found what she sought, her people alive and free. Then a darker thought occurred to him. Do they know who I am? What I was part of? Eliza's expression grew serious. Yes, I told them everything. Mason swallowed hard, suddenly aware of his vulnerability. He was wounded, weakened completely at the mercy of people who had every reason to want him dead. And they still helped me? Not at first, Eliza admitted. When I told them you were a soldier who had been at Yellow Valley, some wanted to let you die. Others wanted to kill you outright. She paused, her eyes holding his. I convinced them otherwise. Why, Mason asked, genuinely perplexed. After what I was part of, why would you argue for my life? Eliza was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Because you chose a different path, she said finally. Because when the moment came to decide between your old life and a new one, you chose to protect rather than destroy. And because, she hesitated, because I believe your spirit is seeking balance as all spirits must. Before Mason could respond, the entrance flap of the shelter was pushed aside. An elderly Apache man entered, his weathered face lined with years, but his eyes sharp and alert. He carried a small bundle of plants in one hand, fresh and green, despite the winter season outside. Ah, the old man said in English, seeing Mason awake. The soldier lives. Eliza rose respectfully. Grandfather, this is Mason Sullivan. Mason, this is White Bear, elder of our band and keeper of the old ways. Mason attempted to sit up, wincing as his wounded shoulder protested. Bumps, he acknowledged, uncertain of the proper protocol, but wanting to show respect. White Bear's gaze was evaluative, taking in Mason's appearance, his bandaged shoulder. Perhaps even Mason thought the weight of his past deeds. My granddaughter tells me you helped her escape those who would have enslaved her again, that you fought to protect her, even against your own kind. She helped me as much as I helped her, Mason replied honestly. I wouldn't be alive without her. The old man nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. The waters have begun your healing, he said, gesturing to Mason's shoulder. But the deeper wounds will take longer. Mason wasn't sure if White Bear meant physical wounds or something more metaphorical, but he nodded in agreement. I'm grateful for your people's help, especially knowing who I am. White Bear's expression remained neutral. Who you were, he corrected. Who you become now is yet to be written. He handed the bundle of plants to Eliza. These will draw out the last of the poison. Make a poultice as I showed you. With that, he turned and left the shelter, leaving Mason with the distinct impression he had just passed some kind of test, though he couldn't have said exactly what kind. Your grandfather, Mason asked Eliza once they were alone again. She nodded, beginning to prepare the plants White Bear had brought. My mother's father. I thought he had died at Yellow Valley, but he was away hunting when the soldiers came. By the time he returned, it was too late to do anything but gather the survivors and lead them here. Mason absorbed this information, grateful that Eliza had found family as well as community. He seems formidable. A small smile touched Eliza's lips. He is, and he doesn't trust easily, especially not white men. The fact that he spoke to you at all is significant. As Eliza worked grinding the fresh plants into a paste, Mason took stock of his condition. His shoulders still ached, but the fiery pain of infection had subsided. His mind was clear for the first time in days, the fever having burned itself out. He felt weak, but no longer at death's door. "These hot springs," he said, gesturing vaguely to indicate their surroundings. "They're why the valley is sacred." "Partly," Eliza replied, adding a small amount of water to her mixture. "Our people have come here to heal for countless generations. The waters contain minerals that draw out sickness, and the warm ground allows plants to grow year-round." She paused in her work, looking around the small shelter. "But it's more than that. This is one of the few places where our people can still live according to the old ways, undisturbed by settlers or soldiers." "Until Hargrove finds it," Mason said quietly. Eliza's hands stilled. "Yes," she agreed. "Until then." The unspoken question hung between them: how long would this sanctuary remain secret? Hargrove had already shown his determination to find the valley, believing it contained gold. Even now his men might be searching the mountains following their trail. And if not Hargrove, then someone else would eventually stumble upon this hidden place. "I've been thinking about that," Mason said, pushing himself up to a sitting position despite the pain it caused. "About Hargrove." Eliza set aside her mortar and pestle, giving him her full attention. "What about him?" "He'll never stop looking," Mason said. "Not as long as he believes there's gold here. And if he finds this place—" He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what would happen if Hargrove discovered a valley of Apache survivors, the same thing that had happened at Yellow Valley 5 years earlier. "What do you suggest?" Eliza asked, her expression guarded. Mason took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "We need to convince him there's no gold here. Better yet, convince him the map is a fake, a wild goose chase." "And how would we do that?" "By bringing him proof," Mason said. "Samples of rock from here that clearly contain no gold. A confession supposedly from you admitting the map was falsified to mislead pursuers." Eliza's brow furrowed. "You want to go back to face Hargrove directly." "Me, not you," Mason clarified. "You've found your people. Your place is here with them. But I—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I have a debt to pay, and this might be my only chance to balance the scales, as your people would say." Eliza studied his face, perhaps searching for signs of the fever's return for delirium that might explain such a risky plan. Finding none, she asked, "And if Hargrove doesn't believe you, if he arrests you as a deserter, or worse, then at least I'll have tried," Mason replied simply, "and I'll have led him away from here in the process. He knows I was helping you. If I return alone claiming you died in the mountains, he might believe the search is over." Eliza was silent for a long time, considering his proposal. Finally, she said, "The elders would need to discuss this. It affects all of us." Mason nodded, understanding the communal nature of Apache decision-making. "Of course, I wouldn't act without their approval." "You should rest now," Eliza said, returning to her preparation of the poultice. "Regain your strength. There will be time for such discussions when you're stronger." Mason didn't argue, knowing she was right. His brief conversation had already tired him more than he wanted to admit. He lay back on the furs, watching as Eliza carefully removed his old bandage and applied the fresh poultice to his wound. Her touch was gentle but sure, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Eliza's eyes met his briefly, something unspoken passing between them. "Rest," she repeated, her voice softer this time. "The waters and the plants will do their work. Your body needs time to heal. As Mason drifted back toward sleep, lulled by the warmth and the faint mineral scent that permeated the shelter, his last conscious thought was that while his body might heal relatively quickly, the deeper wounds, the ones White Bear had alluded to, would indeed take much longer. Perhaps a lifetime. The days that followed passed in a blur of healing and gradual reintegration into the small Apache community. Mason's strength returned slowly but steadily, aided by the natural hot springs that dotted the valley. These pools, ranging from comfortably warm to nearly scalding, were central to the band's winter survival, providing not only therapeutic benefits, but also heat for their shelters, which were strategically positioned to capture the rising steam. The valley itself was a natural fortress, accessible only through narrow passes that could be easily defended, sheltered from the worst of the winter storms by surrounding peaks, and blessed with the hot springs that kept portions of the ground warm enough for year-round plant growth. Mason could see why the Apache considered it sacred, and why they had chosen it as their refuge after the destruction of their previous home. Initially, most of the band kept their distance from him, viewing the white former soldier with understandable suspicion. Children were kept away, and conversations would cease when he approached. Only Eliza White Bear and a few others would interact with him directly. But as days turned into a week, and Mason's proposal to confront Hargrove became known throughout the small community, attitudes began to shift. Some still regarded him with open hostility, but others, particularly those who understood the threat Hargrove represented, began to see him in a different light. On the 7th day after regaining consciousness, Mason was strong enough to join the band's evening council. They gathered in the largest shelter, a structure similar to the one where he had recuperated, but large enough to hold all 28 members of the band. At the center burned a small fire, the smoke rising through a carefully designed opening that dispersed it to avoid creating a visible column that might attract unwanted attention. Mason sat quietly at the edge of the circle, Eliza beside him, to translate when necessary, though many of the Apache spoke at least some English. White Bear, as the eldest and leader of the band, spoke first. Outlining the situation as they understood it, a military officer believed their sacred valley contained gold and was actively searching for it using both soldiers and hired guns like Blackwood. If found, their sanctuary would be destroyed and they would face either death or forced relocation to a reservation. When White Bear had finished, he turned to Mason. "You who once rode with our enemies, tell us of this man Hargrove. What manner of man is he? Can he be reasoned with, bribed, threatened?" Mason considered his words, carefully aware that the entire band was watching him intently. "Colonel Hargrove is driven by ambition above all else. He sees his military career as a means to wealth and status, not as a calling to protect or serve. He cannot be reasoned with if it conflicts with his ambitions, and while he might accept a bribe, he would never honor any agreement that didn't benefit him directly." "And threats?" asked a middle-aged warrior sitting across the fire, his face bearing the scars of old battles. "Would only work if you had the power to carry them out immediately," Mason replied honestly. "Hargrove respects power, not principles." White Bear nodded slowly, absorbing this assessment. "And your plan, to convince him there is no gold here?" Mason leaned forward slightly, careful of his healing shoulder. "Hargrove wants two things, the map, and Eliza, who he believes can interpret it. If I return to Fort Benton with evidence that the map leads nowhere valuable, and with a believable story about Eliza's death, he might abandon the search." "Might?" White Bear repeated skeptically. "And if he does not, if he decides you are lying and continues to search, then at least I will have led him in the wrong direction," Mason said. "Given you time to prepare, or, if necessary, to find a new sanctuary." This prompted a flurry of discussion in Apache, too rapid for Mason to follow even with his limited understanding of the language. Eliza translated the key points. Some believed his plan was their best hope. Others thought it too risky. Still others suggested the entire band should relocate immediately rather than trust their safety to a white man's scheme. The debate continued for hours, with Mason occasionally called upon to answer specific questions about Hargrove military procedures or his own intentions. As the fire burned lower, White Bear finally raised a hand for silence. "We have heard all voices," the old man said. "Now we must decide. This affects all of us, so all must have a say." He produced a small pouch and withdrew a handful of stones, half white, half black. White stone for accepting the plan, black stone for rejecting it. One by one, the adult members of the band approached the elder, took a stone from the pouch without looking, and placed it in a clay bowl beside him. The process was conducted in complete silence, each person's decision private, until all stones were cast. When the last person had voted, White Bear carefully separated the stones in the bowl. There were more white than black, but not by a large margin. "The band has spoken," White Bear announced. "We will accept your offer to confront this Hargrove. But," he added, his gaze sharpening as he looked directly at Mason, "you will not go alone." This pronouncement caused a stir among the Apache. Eliza leaned forward, speaking rapidly in her native tongue, clearly surprised and concerned by this condition. White Bear responded firmly, then switched to English for Mason's benefit. "My granddaughter disagrees, but the safety of our people must come first. If you are captured or killed before reaching Hargrove, our location could still be discovered. Someone must go with you to ensure the message is delivered, or to return and warn us if something goes wrong." "I'll go," Eliza said immediately, her voice leaving no room for argument. "No," White Bear countered. "You are too valuable to risk and too recognizable. Hargrove wants you specifically." He surveyed the gathered band, his gaze settling on a young man perhaps a few years younger than Mason. "Swift Hawk will go." The young man nodded solemnly, accepting the assignment without protest. Mason had seen him around the camp, quiet, observant, skilled with both bow and rifle. If he had to have a companion for this dangerous mission, Swift Hawk seemed a good choice. "When?" Mason asked, realizing the decision had been made. 2 days, White Bear decided. "You need more strength for the journey, and we must prepare what you will take to convince this Hargrove." With that, the council disbanded, the band members dispersing to their individual shelters. Eliza remained beside Mason, her expression troubled. "You don't approve?" Mason asked as they walked slowly back toward his shelter. "It's not that," she said. "I understand the need for someone to go with you. I just—" She hesitated, searching for words. "I wish it could be me." Mason stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In the moonlight reflecting off the snow, her features were softly illuminated, her dark eyes holding his gaze steadily. "Why?" he asked quietly. Eliza seemed taken aback by the directness of the question. "Because I started this journey with you. It feels wrong not to finish it." It was a reasonable answer, but Mason sensed there was more she wasn't saying. Before he could press further, however, she changed the subject. "Come," she said, gesturing toward one of the hot springs. "Your shoulder needs soaking. The minerals will help the final healing before your journey." Mason followed her to the edge of a steaming pool. The water was clear, but had a slight bluish tint, indicating the mineral content that made it therapeutic. He removed his shirt, now able to do so with minimal pain, revealing the healing wound on his shoulder. The angry redness had faded, and new pink skin was forming around the bullet holes. He eased himself into the hot water, sighing, as the heat penetrated his still sore muscles. Eliza knelt at the edge of the pool, reaching into the water to scoop up some of the fine silt from the bottom. This she applied directly to his wound, a practice he had become accustomed to during his recovery. "Your plan is dangerous," she said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. "Hargrove is not a forgiving man." "I know," Mason acknowledged, "but it's the best chance your people have to remain hidden here. Hargrove won't stop searching as long as he believes there's gold to be found. And if he arrests you, or worse," Mason met her concerned gaze, "then I'll have done what I could to balance the scales. For Yellow Valley. For all of it." Eliza's hand, still resting on his shoulder, tightened slightly. "Is that what this is about, penance?" "Partly," Mason admitted. "But not entirely. It's also about doing what's right here and now. Your people deserve to live in peace. Hargrove and men like him have taken enough." She studied his face in the moonlight, perhaps searching for insincerity or hidden motives. Finding none, she nodded slightly. "My grandfather believes your spirit is seeking balance, that helping us is part of your healing path." "Is that what you believe?" Mason asked. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the edge of his healing wound. "I believe people can change," she said finally. "I've seen it in you. The man who rode with those soldiers 5 years ago would not risk his life to protect Apache strangers." It was as close to forgiveness as she had ever offered, and Mason felt its weight not as a burden lifted, but as a responsibility accepted. He couldn't undo the past, but he could choose a different path forward. They remained at the hot spring for some time, talking quietly about the preparations for the journey, about what Mason would say to Hargrove, about contingencies if things went wrong. Throughout the conversation, Eliza's hand remained on his shoulder, her touch both healing and anchoring. When they finally returned to the shelters, the valley was quiet, most of the band already asleep. At the entrance to Mason's shelter, they paused, neither quite ready to part. "Thank you," Mason said simply, "for everything." Eliza's eyes held his in the darkness. "Be careful with Hargrove," she said. "Come back if you can." And the words were practical, pragmatic, but Mason heard the emotion beneath them. Without overthinking, he reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll try," he promised. For a moment, they stood there, connected by their joined hands and all they had experienced together. Then Eliza stepped back, breaking the contact, though her eyes remained on his. "Rest," she said. 2 days will pass quickly." As Mason watched her walk away toward her own shelter, he realized with sudden clarity that returning alive from this mission had become important to him for reasons that went far beyond balancing scales or atoning for past sins. Somewhere along their journey, perhaps in the cabin during the blizzard, perhaps during their desperate flight from Blackwood, or perhaps during these quiet days of healing in the sacred valley, something had changed between them. Whether anything would come of it, whether there was even a future where a former soldier and an Apache woman could build something together, Mason couldn't say, but he knew with certainty that he wanted the chance to find out. With that thought warming him more than the hot springs, had he entered his shelter to rest for the dangerous journey ahead. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold, the sky a crystalline blue above the sacred valley. Mason stood with Swift Hawk at the western pass, both men dressed for the harsh winter journey ahead. They carried minimal supplies, enough food for 5 days, weapons for protection, and most importantly, the evidence they hoped would convince Hargrove to abandon his search for gold. This evidence consisted of rock samples from throughout the valley, carefully selected to show no trace of gold or other valuable minerals, along with a letter supposedly written by Eliza before her death confessing that the map was deliberately misleading, designed to send pursuers on a futile chase while she escaped in another direction. The entire band had gathered to witness their departure, standing in a solemn half-circle at the base of the trail leading up to the pass. White Bear stepped forward, speaking first in Apache to Swift Hawk, then turning to Mason. "You carry our future with you," the elder said gravely. "Our safety depends on your success." Mason nodded, the responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "I understand. I won't fail your trust." White Bear studied him for a long moment, then reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew a familiar object, the silver medallion that had once belonged to Eliza's grandfather, the same one Mason had carried for 5 years after Yellow Valley. "This belonged to my father," White Bear said. "Eliza told me you kept it all these years, that you returned it to her when you learned its significance." Mason nodded, uncertain where this was going. The old man held out the medallion. "Carry it again, not as a reminder of past wrongs, but as a symbol of the path you walk now." Stunned by the gesture, Mason accepted the medallion with reverence. "I'm honored," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll return it when our mission is complete." "See that you do," White Bear replied, though there was a hint of warmth beneath his stern demeanor. "My granddaughter would be most displeased if it were lost again." With the formal farewell complete, the band began to disperse, returning to their daily tasks. Only Eliza remained approaching Mason, as Swift Hawk tactfully moved a short distance away to give them privacy. "Be careful," she said, echoing her words from 2 nights before. "Hargrove is dangerous, especially if he feels threatened or deceived." "I will," Mason promised. "Swift Hawk and I have gone over the plan repeatedly. We'll approach openly, request a meeting with the colonel, present our evidence, and leave. Simple and straightforward." Eliza's expression suggested she found nothing simple about the plan, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached up and touched the silver medallion now hanging around Mason's neck. "My grandfather doesn't part with sacred objects lightly," she said. "He sees something in you worth trusting." "I hope I can live up to that trust," Mason replied honestly. Eliza's hand moved from the medallion to rest lightly on his chest just above his heart. "You already have," she said quietly. "By choosing a different path, when it would have been easier to continue on the old one." Before Mason could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips briefly to his, a kiss so quick and light he might have imagined it, except for the lingering warmth it left behind. "That is for luck," she said, stepping back. "Now go, before I change my mind about letting you face Hargrove without me." Speechless, Mason could only nod. With a final glance at the woman who had changed the course of his life in ways he was only beginning to understand, he turned and followed Swift Hawk up the trail toward the pass. The journey that had begun with a desperate knock on his cabin door during a blizzard had led him here to this moment, this choice. As he crested the pass and looked back one last time at the sacred valley at Eliza, standing small but straight, watching him leave, Mason Sullivan knew with absolute certainty that whatever happened with Hargrove, whatever the future held, he had found something in these mountains worth fighting for, worth living for. And with that knowledge secure in his heart, alongside the silver medallion that symbolized both his past sins and his chance at redemption, he turned westward toward Fort Benton, toward Hargrove, and toward whatever fate awaited him there.